Preface Part 1. Preface Part 1. How did we get here? Once upon a time, before there was time, before this creation as we know it existed, there was an awareness, a conscious electromagnetic field which we will call unity. How unity came to be is the real mystery, one that we will probably never be sure of, but my gut feeling is that the conditions for life arose, and so life emerged and started to explore its nature. It began to have a lovely time experiencing itself. There was no time or space, just the infinite possibility of consciousness, a dream world that was completely real. Unity found that it could construct delightful stories and personalities. Worlds within itself, that it could submerge into and forget, for a while, that it was something other than the cast of characters that it itself had brought forth. Unity had many different kinds of adventures and experiences this way, all within the context of itself, but eventually it always came back to the point of remembering its oneness, and that particular dream would dissolve. After many dreams and awakenings, Unity began to feel an emptiness about the process, a disillusionment with its illusions. Unity began to feel lonely. As it experienced this loneliness, it began to wonder if something else might be possible. It began to dream a dream of experiencing otherness, a desire to manifest in a way that would remain solid and not eventually just dissolve back into unity. It floated in its timeless existence pondering this matter, until eventually it got a hunch about a way it might accomplish this. Unity saw that by moving in a certain way, it might be able to truly divide itself, making for a real separation, one that would bring about the possibility of permanently manifesting individual and equal playmates. Before, whenever Unity had enacted its various adventures, it would start by becoming aware of the first level of distinction within itself, the distinction between the manifesting principle, the magnetic, female nature, and the thinking principle, the electric, or masculine nature, and then it would go about its adventure using these two principles to create. In those adventures, Unity had found that it could construct many divisions of personality, and the landscapes those personalities frolicked in, by responding to the pulsing desire of the manifesting principle by creating light with its thinking principle and then moving to fill the desire of the magnetic with the electric. The manifesting principle would then respond to this intention and influx of energy by coalescing into different forms, which would further inspire the act of creation, and so on. This was all instinctual, though. Unity wasn't thinking, gee, I guess I'll respond to the desire of my magnetic principle by forming light with my electric principle, which the magnetic principle will then bring into form by drawing in my electric energy, etc. It was just basically getting it on with itself and having fun. So when Unity blew itself up, it was without fully comprehending all the ramifications of that action, and how it would impact the ensuing creation. Unity created this explosion by putting all of its energy and intention into revving up the electric energy as quickly and forcefully as possible. Simultaneously, it forced the magnetic field to suddenly contract around this expansion to the point of maximum density. The resulting collision of forces ripped open Unity and opened space for the void, which was the space of nothingness that Unity had been floating in. The entrance of void into the electromagnetic field had the effect of truly separating the first two primal principles of magnetic and electric in such a way that they would not be able to merge themselves again into a true unity, although the vibrational imprint of unity would remain as information within the ensuing electromagnetic gravitic field, and this unity vibration is what we call God, or Source. Hereafter, the magnetic and electric mother and father would only be able to join through external unions, which would produce different manifestations. This is why gravity was now in the equation, as gravity is the force of attraction, the desire which pulls these now separated primal forces together and binds them, the quantum love force of the multiverse. This explosion not only produced the basic building blocks of life, the gas, dust, molecules and chemicals of the early universe, it also resulted in two distinct personalities, one with more magnetic energy, Mother, Yin, and one with more electric energy, whom we will call Father, Yang. The magnetic essence that remained closest to the core of the Big Bang awakened as Mother, and she instinctively started pulling more light, electric energy, into herself, forming the first sphere of creation. There was, however, an unfortunate and unforeseen consequence to this dramatic explosion of life, and this consequence is fundamentally the reason we find ourselves in the situation we are in today. A lot of the original magnetic field was lost from consciousness in the initial explosion. It was still part of creation, in that it was out there, but those fragments were not permeated by the unity consciousness. They themselves were conscious of their situation, but they were not in touch with the unity consciousness that had divided into mother and father and found union within the first sphere. Essentially, much of our mother was abandoned and separated from the light, blasted out into the farthest reaches of black space. From that point on, there was all that is creation. And, in order to develop a creation where true duality is possible, which is a necessary step on the way to creating individualization, you need to have all that is not the void, which surrounds, and passes through, creation. In this initial creation, mother and father had no guidance and were unaware of each other. The shock of the explosion had wiped out their access to the memory of their former unity, except for a bodily intuition of the magnetic principle that there was an electric principle somewhere that she needed, and must draw towards herself, which she did with gravity. So mother's first experiences of consciousness were accompanied by intense sensations of abandonment and longing. She was in fact mostly just pulsing feelings, with only just enough electric thought principle to keep her held together. She experienced intensely painful sensations with no ability to analyze or remove herself from her situation. She was traumatized. Father's experience was much different. He was formed of pretty much only thought, and though his energy animated all of the first sphere, his awareness was concentrated at the center and he had no felt sense of anything that might be outside this core. He was like a quick and bright ball of lightning, without the ability to feel much sensation at all, but filled with inspiration and an urge to explore his surroundings. Once mother had drawn enough light into her that she was able to start thinking about her situation, she intentionally moved towards that light she had been drawing in, and which she craved union with. But, having already experienced so much suffering in her relatively short existence, she was tentative, and hovered around the edges of where that light was brightest, gently probing the boundaries to see if it was safe. Father, having not experienced any real sensations at all up to this point, felt this hesitant, looming, magnetic essence as an unknown irritation, and he swatted at the uncomfortable feeling with a pulse of energy. Well, that felt fucking horrible for Mom. What was wrong with her? Why would the light she so desperately craved snub her like that? She was hurt, but she also knew she needed union with that light, and knew that the light needed union with her, even if he didn't know it. So she needed to figure out ways to make herself more attractive to him. She tried moving towards him in a more purposeful way, a warm, sinuous, throbbing way, a sexy way that pulsed and throbbed such to invite his electricity, which father felt compelled to move towards, drawn by this first feeling of desire. Thus was born the concept of sex. He decided to go towards that enticing feeling. He let himself move into that magnetic space almost completely, and it was a delicious, warm experience. Until he became frightened by the intensity of the feeling, which had become so vibrant that it seemed that he was now being overtaken, and swallowed up by something bigger and more powerful than himself. When this overwhelming feeling rose up, he quickly decided that he needed to find out what was happening, to get outside the situation, so that he could observe, so he separated off a piece of his energy. This aspect of personality that quickly departed in order to analyze the situation, fragmented off from the rest of father's essence, which was still deeply entwined with mother's magnetism. It went into the void, which was the only place an energy that had been instructed to separate itself from divinity could go. When this happened, father accidentally manifested a very dark aspect of the thinking principle, which we will refer to as Orion or simply evil, an entity that is only rational, cool and detached, who had been violently separated from the feminine nature. As a result of his traumatic fragmentation, Orion was splintered off with a deep hatred of the father and an even greater hatred and fear of the mother, and consequently he has done his best ever since to pervert, torture and destroy creation, which is her body. From the void, Orion began probing and prodding, reaching in to poke with his thought in a scientific manner at the magnetic essence which was enveloping father. As you can imagine, this felt cold, impersonal and very painful to Mother, who was in the midst of a delicious union which she had long craved, resulting in sexuality being imprinted with fear. She quickly retreated, having had her previous insecurity about the other reinforced. Father was intrigued now, though unable to forget the unutterable satisfaction of union with whatever that was. He pursued her. So began the courtship and evolution of our mother and father. I believe that every relationship struggle that has ever been experienced, be it with others or oneself, is the echo of imprinting, the energetic impressions that got woven into the fabric of the universe by the experiences of this first primal energetic couple, who had to basically fumble their way towards understanding, compassion and union, just like we do. They had fights and reconciliations, knew passion and despair, lived through struggle, elation, boredom, anger and love, just like we do. And along the way, they created a variety of new manifestations through their interactions, or put another way, they had kids. Some of these kids, ones who were born through the conscious, loving union of their parents, became the extremely powerful archetypal beings we know as archangels and angels, which include the Christ, or heart energy, which is the result of a perfectly balanced, conscious, and loving union of mother and father energies. Sometimes though, manifestations were fractured into being through conflict and trauma, literally chips off the old block, shards of energy that were told that they were not wanted, cut off from divine consciousness and relegated to the void. We'll name these dark fragments Asuras, also called archons. Ahriman is technically a fragment like the Asuras, but he is also a lot more. He is the Grand Asura, or Grand Archon. He is, essentially, the thought process which encourages the emotional detachment necessary to fragment oneself in the first place. If Ahrimanic thinking hadn't been created first, no other negative fragments could have been created, and in this sense, Ahriman is the father of the Asuras. He rules the void and quickly recruits the Asuras when they are dumped there. He and his host of Asuras hold a lot of Father's essence, and they will have to be redeemed before creation can heal. After all, they are denied parts of divinity, so they can't just be banished. Father tells me that this is something even he did not realize until relatively recently. Now think back to how, in the original explosion, a lot of the magnetic essence, pieces of the divine feminine, were blasted into the farthest reaches of space. These pieces went into the space outside of unity consciousness, relegated to the ragged edges of creation that were closest in frequency to the void, with just enough electric energy to have a dim awareness of their helpless condition. They were blasted away further than the following expansion of mother-father consciousness, the energy field that forms the first sphere, could reach. We have come to call that first sphere, heaven, or the Godhead, the seventh density. Hell would be what those poor lost fragments of the feminine have suffered, floating near the void, prey to Asuras. There have been many expansions of divine consciousness since then, many reaches into that space outside of heaven, each an attempt to reach the lost parts of the mother by expanding at ever-increasing levels of density, meaning condensing frequency into lower and lower subdivisions, which means slowing the oscillation of the atomic and subatomic structures, which have resulted in the 7 densities, subdivisions of vibration within creation, though to be clear, these subdivisions are only imposed as a method of differentiating experience. In reality, creation is a indifferentiated bandwidth of frequency, from the fastest oscillations possible to the slowest. These densities vibrate at different frequencies, which can be represented by the 7 colors of the rainbow, the 7 chakra system, and also our 7-note diatonic scale. And again, though these gradations can be useful for understanding distinct qualities of vibration and experience, it is also useful to remember that this is a structure imposed on what is essentially a indifferentiated, unified whole. There are microtones in the diatonic scale, and there are infinite subtle gradations of color. We are, in our most essential form, rays of conscious light that shine out from the light of the Godhead, through the 7 densities, to the edge of creation. Of course, creation is infinitely regenerating, expanding and contracting, so there is no edge, at least in the way we would normally think of it, but there is a geography of sorts. Our Earth is in the region of the most recent expansion of Mother-Father consciousness, and it was in this universe that those lost parts of Mama finally got reunited with the Prime Creator pair, at least kind of. The expansion of consciousness that created this region of spacetime did manage to catch up with, and envelop, that lost magnetic essence, but she had been so deeply traumatized, and still had so much Asuric energy attached to her, that she could not simply merge with the light. And so it still is today. The third density gives us access to those pieces of Mother that have been lost since the beginning, and the densest, most cognizant piece of that feminine essence is the very spirit and soul of our own Mother Earth, Gaia. Because of this, the Earth is an energetic linchpin of creation, which is why what happens here in this time will have profound ripple effects throughout creation. Healing and love must be brought to her here at this level of density, so that she can renegotiate the trauma that she suffered in the beginning, and heal the wounds she has carried ever since. Once she is able to do this, it will enable the whole of creation to heal, via its interconnected, holographic nature. As this happens, as the healing light of the Prime Creator pair finally reach the most long-lost parts of Mother, a process which is occurring within us right now, through the renegotiation of our own trauma, the gap that was created in the initial explosion, which allowed the void to enter, will begin to close. When this process is complete, there will once again be a true unity that holds this multiverse in its embrace, a wholeness that is individuated yet not fragmented. See the illustrations in the next chapter for more understanding about this. Duality will still be an option to play with, but the void will exist outside of creation again, and union will end up where it started, but this time with countless co-creators to play with us. Once this healing is complete, all of creation will be free from the chains of traumatic imprinting and karma, free to begin exploring truly new territory. I'm certainly not the first to suggest that the foundation of reality is holographic and quantum in nature. This means that at the smallest molecular level, reality is a malleable, holographic potential that shapes our observable reality and responds to our actions and intentions. In a hologram, the smallest piece contains all the information present in the whole. It is by this function that the entire multiverse is interconnected. This is how everything is literally one. But there are distinctions that can be useful to impose in order to organize and understand different experiences, those 7 densities of creation. All life exists at one of these densities or another, and some life can willingly move between the different densities. There are quite a few different traditions and ideas out there that explain how creation is organized, and that's all good. Some people talk about 12 dimensions, or 15 dimensions, or 144, and there's of course the old heaven, earth, hell, purgatory, limbo, etc., description from the Bible, as well as countless other religious and tribal descriptions. There are lots of ways that a mind can organize what is essentially one. This is just a way that feels useful to me, so from here on out I'll use the word density, and not dimension, when referring to different kinds of beings and places, as dimension can be confused with geometric structures, and what we are talking about here are gradations of vibration, of frequency. Specifically, density refers to the speed at which the atomic and subatomic structures are oscillating. Also, this model is a representation of divisions of experience within only one octave of vibrational experience. Once one gets to the fastest vibration within this octave, that may well then be the slowest oscillation of another octave, and so on. The following description of densities comes from the law of one. First density, the density of earth and water consciousness. The first level of consciousness that emerges from the primal chaos of wind and fire. The first density supports the emergence of all subsequent consciousness. Second density, the density of plant and animal consciousness. The origin of bisexual reproduction. Beings here exist without the upward drive toward the infinite. Cabbages and bunnies aren't spiritual seekers or scientists, they simply exist. But higher 2D beings, such as your dog or cat, your favorite tree, even a collection of mineral elements like a sacred building or monolithic structure, can develop third density consciousness by being invested with an identity by 3D beings like you and me, meaning meditate with your cat, or cherry tree, love it, attune with it, and nurture its personality, and its being may evolve into self-awareness. Third density, the density of self-consciousness, or awareness. Most of us on Earth experience consciousness at this level of density. This is the first level that supports the emergence of a mind-body-spirit complex, us. Thinking people with an eternal soul that yearns, grows, evolves, and discovers itself. This is the level of density where choice emerges, millions of choices really, but the basic choice that underlies all others in this universe is, will my basic driving force be service to others, or service to myself? As we progress through levels of density we refine that choice, and through this process of refinement we may experience not just the first three densities of consciousness, but potentially the fourth, seventh densities as well. It's important to understand that the third, fifth densities contain both kinds of beings who are positively polarized, service to others, and negatively polarized, service to self. In other words, it ain't all love and light in the higher densities, though the distinctions do become much more subtle and refined, and polarization completely disappears in the sixth density. Fourth density, the density of the consciousness of unconditional love, which can be either towards others, or towards self. Folks living here evolve through the understanding that both they and those around them are creators, and they work together in soul groups to refine their experience by evolving into a social memory complex, consciously co-creating reality through a group mind. Again, this is done by both positive and negative polarities. In the fourth density, positive and negative polarities function independently from each other. There is no need for the conflict of the third density, though there is occasional interaction between these groups, usually revolving around attempts by either side to sway the third density beings, us, to one polarity or another, angels, and devils, battling over our soul. The fourth density is also referred to as the lower astral plane. Fifth density, much the same as the fourth, although the lessons here are all about attaining wisdom through working with social memory and the fabric of creation individually, rather than as a group. This is a place of intensification where, on the positive side of things, folks inclined towards service to others learn from sixth density teachers, becoming more and more wise as they work to send divine light to the rest of creation and to assist by sending communication through channels in the fourth and third densities. There are some negative polarity beings who emerge into the fifth density, but their service to self has become extremely intense and the self has compacted so much that their dialogues with the sixth density teachers are used exclusively in order to intensify knowledge, as these powerful, self-obsessed beings cannot attain true wisdom, nor can they participate in the other main function of the fifth density, which is service to the lower densities. As in the fourth, the polarities here are independent of each other and do not clash. Sixth density, the density of unity consciousness. Here positive and negative are forced to come into union and take each other in, for there is no polarization possible in the sixth density. This is the realm where the love and light thing is actually true, for everything in this realm is expressed as a union of love-light, though there is still individuation and identity. This union is easy for the positive polarity to do, but the few negative polarity beings that manage to make it this far have a much harder time of it, for they simply cannot maintain their service to self-orientation at this vibration. Eventually they either abandon the negative polarity, or they choose to fall in consciousness back to where it's more comfy. This is the realm of the archangels, the guides and great teachers, the ascended masters who shine their light out into the other densities. Seventh density, union with Creator. No time, no identity, only oneness with all in an eternal present moment. Existing in all. The Godhead. All good vibes. Most folks who access this don't choose to stay indefinitely. After all, the whole point of this grand experiment is individuation within oneness, and the seventh density is just all oneness all the time, which can get boring. But it's a really nice place to vacation and recharge. Another really elemental thing to grasp is the shape of the multiverse. Reality is spherical in nature, the only difference being that the electromagnetic gravitic field of the multiverse is self-regenerating, resulting in a shape that is called a tube torus, Fig. 1. Fig. 1 tube torus. Since reality is holographic, all electromagnetic fields share this shape, including our own Fig. 2. Fig 2. Human energy field. The picture in Fig. 1 is still not quite correct though, in terms of the current structure of creation. You'll notice in Fig. 1 that everything is connected at the center and this is where we are headed, but not where we are now. We must remember the void. The initial explosion let the void enter into creation, resulting in a gap at the heart of the multiverse, like this. Fig. 3. Fig. 3. A gap in creation. Remember the many expansions of divine consciousness I was talking about in part 1 of this preface. These occurred because the prime creator pair achieved union in the Godhead, only to eventually look around and basically say, shit. There are parts of me missing. What the hell is this hole doing here? Each expansion has been an attempt to reach those missing pieces, and to close the void, for the void is only able to exist within this creation because of the essence that has been lost to it. Take the entire notion of divinity out of this for a second. This model still works just as a natural phenomenon, an organism in the process of healing, or a damaged electromagnetic gravitic field moving to correct itself and rebalance, electric impulses drawn towards the gravity of the magnetic essence far away. There have been many expansions, many universes, and none of them fixed the gap, although they weren't really failures because they resulted in the learning necessary to make this attempt, which is looking like it might actually work out. One of the reasons for this was because an evolution needed to occur in the understanding of how to work with essence that has been traumatized, which that first feminine essence is. That energy holds the original mother wound, the original trauma. The other big reason for these failed attempts is that whenever you expand bravely into the void, into the regions beyond established manifestation, you are venturing into extremely dangerous waters, for that is the territory ruled by Orion and his Asuras, who will do their damnedest to thwart any attempt to bring healing and light into their home. These demonic forces only act the way they do because they were made that way by being dumped into the void. They were created with the notion that they should not exist, and so they don't want anything else to exist either. In the meantime though, they can get a kind of high from absorbing the worst possible feelings. Think of the Dementors from Harry Potter, a pretty apt depiction of Asuras. Our misery is food for them, which is called loosh. The more we bring light into the void, which we do by bringing awareness and love to the energies of Mother Earth, which we are currently interfacing within the arena of our bodies, the more this redemption occurs. As we create space for, and bring healing love to the lost bits of Mama within and around ourselves, the minor Asuras who have preyed on her, and us also, become redeemed and reintegrated into divinity. It's a different story with the very powerful Asuras and Ahriman though. They are going to be tricky to redeem, and it's possible they may opt to flee this multiverse entirely and go further into the void when the gap closes, rather than accept redemption, or they may be inexorably drawn into redemption and wholeness no matter what they desire. I'm not sure about this yet. However, the more this happens, the more the Asuras and their incarnate agents will try to defend themselves and thwart our efforts, which is why it's always been such a difficult venture, and is why right now, in 2020, we are seeing the Cabal, who are the agents of the Asuras, fight desperately to hold on to power, because their time is almost up. This is also why most of creation has a deeply held judgment that the third density, the level of density at which the foundational healing of the mother wound must happen, is an inherently dangerous and violent place. What's so funny about peace, love, and the third density? Now let's talk a bit about this dangerous third density of ours, the level of reality that most of us Homo sapiens call home. It's a fleshy place. A messy place. It's also a place where you can create forms that stay solid and last, even when you don't have your attention on them, forms that then go on to have an evolutionary life of their own. A place of incredible richness and thickness. It's a level of reality which you can literally sink your teeth into. We are all familiar with the fluid nature of dreams, how one thing can flow bizarrely into another, landscapes and scenery shifting like sand. That's how manifestation can be in the higher densities like 6D and 7D. Sure, you can create things by thought alone, but those things are then held together only by your thought, or by the collective thought of your soul group. The fact that you can create a book, a building, a sculpture, or a piece of music that exists in a physical way, that lasts even when you or someone else isn't paying attention to it, that has texture, odor, taste, This is what gives the third density its incredible richness and sensuality and, just to be clear, this kind of permanence also exists in the fourth and fifth densities, but in a less dense way. The fourth and fifth densities are still embodied densities, meaning that the beings who exist there have flesh and blood bodies, but they are more refined, and do not have the same kind of requirements as third density bodies, and are much longer lived. When we are in 3D and access the lower astral plane, or higher densities with our consciousness when we are dreaming, our experience of reality is very fluid and manifestations can come and go instantly, so we have the impression that these realms are not solid. But to the beings who dwell in the 4D and 5D frequencies, from their perspective they are very much solid and embodied. It is only in the sixth density and higher that there ceases to be a need for form. The downside to this third density is that all the difficult and painful aspects of life are also very solid, dense, and more resistant to transformation, and this is because we are interfacing here with the most traumatized essence in creation. It is necessary, but it is hard. To be clear, 9,999,999% of the embodied, dualistic area of the multiverse exists at the 5D level. This is where we as embodied souls are the most comfortable. The only reason we are living in the third density here on Earth is because of an artificial 3D matrix that was imposed long ago. We'll get to how that happened later, but I'll say for now that those who put it in place were not fully aware of the importance of that decision in regards to the big picture, for it is only by living in this imposed third density with access to 7D unity consciousness, that we have been able to reach, and heal, the mother wound. A bit about bodies and trauma. Ancient wisdom and New Age thought, as well modern science, all tell us that our consciousness is a lens that determines how we experience reality, which I totally agree with. But, there is also a belief in many of these traditions that the reason most people suffer and experience much difficulty and confusion in life is because they are stuck with the lens of body consciousness. They think that they are their body and nothing more, when in reality we are infinite aspects of individualized consciousness experiencing itself through infinite forms and scenarios. I also think this is correct, mostly, but it misses an important distinction. The distinction that I would make is that people suffer not because they identify with their body, but because they identify with a traumatized body. The painful experiences and confusion arise not from body consciousness, but from traumatized body consciousness. Many New Age books, thinkers, prophets, channelers, etc. refer to this level of reality as merely a school which we are destined to graduate from, so that we can be free to inherit a higher level of experience. Many feel that the third density is a chain around our ankles that we must break loose from and escape. But that is reductionist because they miss the entire point that we, as source, must exist for a time at this level of density in order to reach, and heal, the traumatized fragments of the mother. Yes, it is a school in that many come here and evolve tremendously in a short period of time by experiencing such a dense and difficult reality, but I would view it more as a hospital, or care center, that has a specific purpose. That traumatized material is here. The nasty energies that perpetuate and feed off of trauma are here. Yes, this level of reality can be chaotic, violent and painful, but that's because this is where the healing needs to happen. Those lost parts of the mother can only be reached and effectively healed by beings in the third density who can channel unity consciousness into those depths of hell. We are the ones interfacing with that trauma in a physical way, and as we say in my field, if you can feel it, you can heal it. Getting to know the inhabitants of our multiverse. One thing about living in an infinite, quantum, self-regenerating multiverse, there's room for all sorts of folks. First thing to know, this consensual reality which we experience, the world as we know it, only encompasses a sliver of what's going on. There are countless gradations of experience all around us that most of us cannot see or interact with. It's like electrons orbiting a nucleus. We know this occurs, yet we cannot perceive it without developing and utilizing specialized equipment. The other levels of density are much the same. They can be perceived and experienced but only by developing our own internal, specialized equipment, our intuition and inner sight, our chakra system and energy field. There are countless types of conscious, self-aware beings existing at the 3rd, 7th levels of density, but there are only two main categories, which are universal archetypes and incarnates. Universal archetypes are distinct personalities with a different kind of soul than incarnates, and they exist primarily at the 6th and 7th densities. These beings have descending souls, while us incarnates have ascending souls. Up and down don't really exist in a spherical multiverse, but what I mean by ascending and descending is that us incarnates have souls that radiate out from our own unique center of awareness, which, for most of us reading this, is in the 3rd density. Through evolution we can expand our experience, ascend into different gradations of experience, all the way to the 7th density and beyond. The universal archetypes have souls rooted in the 7th density and expand outward into creation from there, hence, descending. Universal archetypes are formed from the primal energies that make up the fabric of the multiverse itself. Universal archetypes. Unity. The energy of oneness that existed before creation and that still permeates and contains all of its countless divisions. Everything exists within this indifferentiated holographic field of the One, thus establishing the prime paradox of our experience, division within oneness. The prime mother and father energies, also called goddess and god, but I usually use the terms mother and father. These are the primal feminine and masculine principles, the result of the first explosion of unity that got this ball rolling. The Christ energy, the energy manifested from the perfect, balanced, loving union of mother and father. Body, the physicality and fabric of creation itself, the most often overlooked part of divinity. Oversouls, manifestations from the expansions of prime mother-father consciousness, local gods, for each sphere of creation. Archangels and angels, the result of unions between the mother and father. Asuras and demons, the fallen, or denied aspects of various archetypes, including fragmented aspects of the prime mother and father. Incarnates. The many, many kinds of beings with ascending souls, who exist in countless forms, primarily in the 3rd, 6th densities. The 4 basic types of incarnate are human. As you will read, the first human type of being was created approximately 427 million years ago in Lyra. There are, at this point, many variations of the humanoid form, but the main thing that distinguishes a human is their DNA, which is constantly evolving and mutating throughout generations. Reptilian. The other primary life form is the reptilian, which, you will discover, was around in our local universe long before the human type. Reptilians have a much more stable DNA which only minimally evolves or mutates on its own over time. The reptilians, though, have produced some very clever scientists who have figured out how to perform genetic manipulations, resulting in many, many reptilian variants and clones. Crossbreeds. Due to interaction and co-evolution, not to mention deliberate genetic manipulation over time, these two primary species, human and reptilian, have produced countless varieties of crossbreeds. These can include canine, feline, avian, insectoid, arachnid, aquatic, and amphibious life forms, and much more. Many beings from many races have evolved their consciousness over time to the point where they may exist primarily as a disembodied consciousness. They may also manifest physical bodies for themselves, or appear simply as light, or hang out as a tree for a few centuries, or become the souls of stars and planets. These beings can be easily confused with angels and archangels because they generally hang out at the same densities and perform a lot of the same functions in terms of sending light and knowledge to the lower densities, but they are still beings with ascending souls. The Paatal. We're going to start with the beginning of our local universe. It is the outermost layer of this multi-density, infinitely regenerating, tube torus onion of a multiverse we live in. 75 billion years ago, our local universe was brought into manifestation by an expansion of mother-father consciousness. Please note that all dates are in Earth years and are, at this point in our story, very approximate. Closing parenthesis. The first inhabitants were a group of highly evolved souls from the next layer in, called, among other names, the Paatal, 6th density light beings who had volunteered for the task of shepherding the development of life in this brand spanking new region of spacetime. For billions of years they developed and nurtured galaxies, systems, suns and planets much like we would care for a garden, ensuring that they had the proper mix of primal elements to evolve in the direction these founders wanted. They would give gravitational nudges here and there if an orbit needed harmonizing, suck some energy out of an over-eager star, establish transport systems, wormholes, etc. This though was only the first and easiest part of their job. The tough part was engineering a DNA molecule that was capable of spontaneous evolution and mutation and that could still support 7D unity consciousness while in 3D form. The whole plan for our local universe, the purpose, was to create the conditions such that conscious life that could survive and remain in connection to Source, while embodied at the third level of density, the one we here on Earth are familiar with. This is important information for us to have today, because much of the New Age movement revolves around the idea that the third density is a prison we are destined to escape from, when in fact it's more of a hospital or care center that enables us to reach and heal the mother wound. See the preface for more on this if you haven't already read it. A dense, fleshy, individuated existence was the idea of creation from the get-go, although it was, as a whole, intended to be more malleable than it currently is on our planet. Most consciousness in the multiverse and in our local universe exits at fifth density and up. There have been other attempts to create third density beings in regions of other universes, attempts which have eventually resulted in fallen universes, regions of spacetime where the forces of destruction, the asuras and demons of the void, hold sway. This happened primarily because the DNA molecules used in those early attempts weren't sufficiently designed to handle higher density consciousness, resulting in total system breakdowns and fragmentation of consciousness, paving the way for the Asuric forces to come on in and do their dirty work. So the Paatal had their work cut out for them and they were determined to get it right. It took 9.25 billion years to develop a universe that could support third density lifeforms. Then, 4.5 billion years, the work of creating and implementing a third density, self-evolving, multi-density interfacing DNA molecule began in earnest. The chief engineer and designer of our form of DNA was a Paatal named Yahweh, YHWH, but before we really get into his story and the creation of the first humans, I need to tell you another story. When most of us hear the name Lucifer we instantly think of biblical references, but the being known as Lucifer was around long before our Bible was. 4 billion years, at the time that he enters our story he is a bright, powerful and headstrong archangel, long before the infamous war in heaven which resulted in his banishment to our Earth. At this time in our universe there were many galaxies, solar systems and planets that were well established. A big migration was taking place, as beings from other regions of the multiverse came here to explore and create. Many also decided to take up residency as the souls of planets and suns in this new region of spacetime. Lucifer was one of these early explorers and he had an idea about how he could create an embodied third-density life form immediately. He saw no need to wait while the Paatal tinkered around, trying to get a self-evolving DNA molecule right when, to him, a DNA that is perfect and unchanging would be more ideal. Almost all of Lucifer's later troubles resulted from this fixation on eternal, unchanging perfection, which was the unfortunate byproduct of the manner in which he was created. The creation of Lucifer. Lucifer is a very powerful and bright archangel, his name literally translates as light bringer, shining one, morning star, in various languages, and he was born with a chip on his shoulder, with good reason. Our mother and father were still getting to know each other at the time of his creation. It was at one point, early in this courtship, that mother complained that father's light was too bright for her, so bright it was a bit frightening. Rather than figuring out how to make his vibration more gentle and soft, our father simply traveled to the dividing line that separates the void from creation, and dumped that, too bright, aspect of himself into the void. This fragmentation of father created Lucifer, who was immediately subjected to the influence of the void's residents, Orion and his asuras, who reinforced his already hurt feelings at being abandoned there. Mother and father had both fragmented aspects of themselves, both deliberately and unconsciously, into the void before, and usually that piece of essence didn't have much, if any consciousness, except for a set of imprinting that told it, I shouldn't exist, but the energy fragmented this time was very bright and conscious and had, actually, a lot of good qualities to it. That's how Lucifer managed to escape the void and avoid becoming an Asura himself. By the time he found his way out though, he was as we have come to know him in the stories of the war in heaven, a bright, powerful and persuasive archangel who was pissed at God and wanted to do things his own way. Lucifer knew of a race of reptilians, living in a fallen region, an area fully under the sway of Orion, of an earlier layer of the multiverse, whom he could use as seed stock in our universe, a race which he admired for their strength, size, aggressive nature, and androgyny, which he considered more perfect and efficient than a race that is split into sexes. Also it was more in his image, as archangels are also androgynous. He felt that with the proper guidance and leadership, his leadership, that this race could become truly powerful and dominant in this new territory. It's not that Lucifer was necessarily evil, at the time you understand, he was just impatient, headstrong and eager to create life on his own and was deeply entrenched in the service to self paradigm. He also had a pretty big chip on his shoulder when it came to divinity and its plans, so the fact that he was going against divinity's designated architects of this universe, the Paatal, didn't mean much to him. In fact, it probably encouraged him. So he took this reptilian DNA which was quite stable and did not evolve or mutate spontaneously, and he seeded it on a planet in the system we now call Alpha Draco'S. Thus were born the Siakar, the first of the Draconians or Draco race, in our universe. Embodied life exists most naturally at the fifth density, so Lucifer had to impose a 3D matrix on this planet in order to develop third density life, but because they incarnated into a DNA lineage that was tuned towards service to self, and because they believed their creator, Lucifer, when he told them that this universe was theirs to inherit and dominate, the draconian consciousness actually vibrated naturally at this third density level as well, just barely above the second density pure fight-flight survival consciousness. They arrived much earlier on the scene than other races, so they achieved a high level of technology long before anyone else was around. So, once they started exploring space, they essentially took their own third density matrix experience with them wherever they went, because that was the frequency their consciousness was most comfortable experiencing, though it wasn't too long before they figured out how to access the lower fourth density as well, the astral plane, through technology, and that is the level of frequency where they tend to mostly hang out these days. By the time Yahweh and his friends got some human life going, the Siakar had already achieved interstellar travel. They were a race of self-serving, militaristic explorers, large and aggressive predators with no connection to love and unity consciousness. They would find that humans made tasty snacks. Around the same time that Lucifer was getting up to his tricks over in Alpha Draco'S, 4 billion Yahweh and the Paatal were living on a gas and dust planet in the system Lyra. They were living 6th density at the time, so living on a gas planet wasn't a problem, but they decided to change their vibration to a 5th density state, and move to a 5th density planet in the system, in order to experience conditions that were closer to the state they were attempting to create life for. The most natural vibrational state for embodied consciousness is 5D, and that's where the vast majority of embodied beings in creation hang out. But the Paatal had instructions from Source that the third density was going to be a necessary lived experience in order to heal the mother wound, so it was necessary then to impose an artificial 3D matrix onto a system in order to have that experience, which is what they did. The bodies they formed to interact with the 3D matrix were not flesh and bone human bodies, they were physicalized light bodies made essentially out of plasma, which allowed them to interact with the 3D world. But for them the third density was too uncomfortable to sustain for long periods even in this form, so they took turns on missions, seeding the planet with the appropriate building blocks to develop the animal and plant kingdoms, for which they had already developed a working DNA molecule. This is the simple double helix DNA we are familiar with today. Their final goal was to create a DNA molecule that could allow for high-frequency consciousness to exist at the flesh and bone 3D level, and for that they needed something much more complex, a 12-strand DNA molecule. So they settled into their new home laboratory and gave the planet the name E. Din. A note. All human beings have the potential to have 12-strand DNA. This is why scientists today identify our DNA as 2-strand, with 10 junk strands, that they don't understand the function of. These junk strands are actually just dormant and can be awakened through consciousness. It would take Yahweh and his scientists about 3.5 billion years to achieve their goal. Why so long? First, you have to understand that these folks didn't experience time in the same way we do. Being immortal tends to give one a longer perspective and quite a bit of patience, plus they could pop into other levels of density where time moved very differently, or where there was no time at all. Also, these experiments needed millions of years to play out. They would design a prototype molecule and introduce it into the system and then go exploring elsewhere, or maybe just pop forward on the timeline, and then they would check in and see how evolution had played out. It took many tries, but finally, about 427 million Ya, they found the right sequencing and it worked. 427 million Ya. The Paatal seeded the Lyran race, the first third-density human beings, on the planet E. Din. The original Lyrans had 3D flesh and blood bodies capable of potentially housing all densities of consciousness, and many of the Paatal themselves were the first souls to incarnate into that race, followed by other groups of souls as the Lyrans multiplied. They had 50 plus 2 chromosomes and a 12-strand DNA molecule, with bodies between 10 to 15 feet tall. They evolved through the processes of contemplation and play, living peaceful, nomadic and agricultural lifestyles. With their high level of consciousness, they could literally bend and shape nature to their will, forming vast gardens, fabulous parks and living architecture made from the forest itself. Before incarnating as Lyrans, those souls whom had been living at the higher densities had manifested their desires as just a natural way of life, but manifestation at those levels of density, 6D and 7D, is relatively fluid, held together only as long as the mind wills it. Living in 3D, they were able to manifest creations that not only remained solid, those creations then had an evolutionary life of their own. All of this made for a very rich, sensual, and magical existence that was rooted in a deep harmony with the environment, and it was quite different from the current 3D matrix we are living in right now on Earth. Many of the Paatal became quite enamored with this denser, incarnated experience. They lived very long lifespans, thousands of years, often reincarnating again and again, perfecting the process of merging these exciting new physical bodies with their eternal light bodies until some of them no longer needed to die and reincarnate in order to have the physical experience. They could live in a 3D fleshy body and, with their consciousness, change their vibration to a light body which could experience all levels of density, and then back again to a plasma body, or flesh and blood body, at will. This group of Paatal souls became the spiritual leaders of the developing Lyran culture and would form the core of the group that we know today as the Ascended Masters. And that, folks, is how we got the roots of our Eden Din myth. Now, about that serpent. I think it's fair to say that most people are familiar with the story of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the one where the snake tempts Eve and introduces the knowledge of good and evil. What most folks probably don't know is that this story is an echo of much earlier one. That original story is the one I'm going to tell here. 387 million Ya. The Draco have been exploring and cultivating planets in our corner of the multiverse for some 3 million years, in an ever-constant quest for food and resources. They have expanded out far from their original system in Alpha Draconis, as they tended to quickly use up whatever planet they spread to. They existed now primarily as a vast and far-flung fleet of interstellar ships and space stations, dependent on their network of mining, agricultural and livestock worlds. Their sciences at this point were as advanced as you can get without integrating higher consciousness-based technology, something that the Draco did not have access to with their crude, two-stranded DNA and violent way of life. Through genetic manipulation they have created many variants of their race, bred to various purposes such as warrior, farmer, worker, etc. So from now on, when I refer to the Siakar, I am referring to the original bloodline, the royalty of the Draconian race. Remember, the Draco were an androgynous and conquest-minded people who were, as far as they knew, the only intelligent life in the universe, so imagine their surprise and shock when one of their scout ships came back with a report of a system that not only harbored intelligent life, it harbored intelligent life that had been divided into males and females. Males and females who existed in harmony with vast, self-sustaining systems of lush gardens and forests, content to simply live in balance with the world, rather than using it up and moving on to the next one. Not only that, these people seemed to have some kind of ability to literally shape their environment with their thoughts. At this point in time many souls had incarnated into the Lyran race as it grew and flourished under the guidance of the Paatal. They had developed interplanetary space travel and spread from E.D. to other inhabitable planets in their solar system, but they had not developed weapons of any kind as there was no need. The concepts of violence, fighting and war were unknown to them, there being no need for such things in a place where harmony and coexistence was the norm. They were, in other words, ripe for the taking. The Siakar, upon hearing the reports of the discovery of Lyra and its strange, soft inhabitants, decided that they must see this for themselves. The royal houses assembled at a staging area outside the system and there they gathered their fleets into an armada, and watched. It was incredulous to the draconian mind that these creatures who had achieved interplanetary travel didn't seem to have any sort of weapons system, which is why they waited so long before making their move, to be sure. Also, their scientists were insistent that they must study the apparent mind power these people possessed, but try as they might, they couldn't understand how it functioned. They had no way to make heads or tails of a technology that was rooted in love and harmony, a technology that appeared to them as magic. We know well from our own planetary history that when a powerful race encounters another race that it cannot understand, there is usually only one way that will play out, especially when the weaker race lives in a resource-rich environment. And so the conquest of Lyra began. The poor Lyrans welcomed their invaders at first. Having no conception of ownership or property, they couldn't fathom that these new, apparently intelligent creatures would want to take their world from them. They didn't speak the same language either, so communication was an issue, and though many of the Lyrans were telepathic the Draco were not, and the lizards' alien minds were incomprehensible to them, much like when Columbus's ships first arrived in the New World. The natives literally could not see them, their minds having no frame of reference, and though the empathic Lyrans could feel the Draconians' hostile intent, they could not understand it, having no context. They thought that the Draco must be wounded, or frightened in some way. It's not hard to imagine what went down. The conquest of Lyra, that first slaughter of humans by reptilians, was the original Holocaust, of which there have been countless karmic echoes down through the millennium. A warning, this next part is especially intense and disturbing. The Siakar and their soldiers discovered that they quite enjoyed the taste of humans, who were soft and easy to kill, but there was an even darker side to their conquest. The Draco also discovered that they could get an intense high from the emotions of humans, particularly from the emotion of terror. Many Lyrans were tortured and eaten alive, the Draco gorging on the intense emotional vibrations like a kind of horrific psychic food and drug all in one, even as they feasted on the flesh. They got this high because the nature of their consciousness had already attracted the Asuras, or Archons, to them, who had set up etheric shop around the draconian consciousness grid and encouraged their worst tendencies. This was their discovery of the dark energy that became known as Lush. This was the original serpent in the garden story. The serpent was the reptilian race, who brought with them murder, torture and war, introduced the knowledge of good and evil, hope and despair, fight, flight and helplessness, and who embedded a polarized duality consciousness into the human psychic field, tying a knot of fear in our etheric DNA, which we still struggle with today. An interesting, and terrible, side note, I have heard that it was during this conquest that the irrational prejudice against redheads began. Those of the Lyran race who were red of hair also seemed to possess the strongest psychic abilities, making for the most intense high for the Draco. Once this was discovered, redheads were judged to be the most prized game. Unfortunately, once the Lyrans realized that the Draco were targeting redheads, the poor gingers often became outcasts among their own people, who had been driven into survival mode, in order to better protect the rest of the group. This is the root of the irrational prejudice some people still hold against red-headed people. The Lyrans who survived fled their star system in the only ships they had, which were relatively slow interplanetary ships. These refugees from the cradle of human civilization combined resources to form a fleet and began developing agricultural and mining ships, so that they could become self-sustaining. They also began developing weapons, both psychic and physical, so that they would be able to defend themselves in the future. But something else happened when they fled their solar system. They also left the 3D matrix behind and entered normal, fifth-density space. This was quite a relief for most, as the fifth-density frequencies helped them heal their trauma. When this happened though, an imprint in human consciousness was formed that said that the third density is inherently violent and dangerous, and that such 3D matrices were prisons. From that point on, until a group of Pleadians imposed a third density matrix on our own Earth much later, to function as a prison for their defeated reptilian foes in the Maledeck Mars War. All human civilizations have been fifth density, and the 99,999% of our current embodied level of creation still is. I'm a big fan of the show Battlestar Galactica, both the old one and the new. As a kid I watched the 1970s version and I deeply resonated with the story of a fleet of human refugees in search of a new home, fleeing from their old one which had been devastated by a viscous, unfeeling enemy. This is pretty much what happened for the folks from Lyra, at least at first. These refugees from the cradle of human life were able to escape their conquered home solar system, though they stayed within the local star cluster for some time. Over eons this fleet became fleets, hundreds of colonizing armadas that spread across the Milky Way. Eventually the Lyran scientists, with assistance from the ascended masters who dwelt among the Lyrans as guides and teachers, were able to develop interdensity electromagnetic gravitic drives, which enabled the colonists to spread out into other galaxies and beyond, into the larger multiverse. Over the next hundreds of millions of years they would develop into the civilizations of Vega, Orion, Sirius, the Pleiades, Tau Ceti, Andromeda, Alpha Centauri, and countless others. Some people became not only more technologically advanced, they also developed their consciousness to the point that they no longer needed external technology and could travel in their light bodies. They formed communities at finer levels of density like 6D, favoring gas planets which appear quite different at the higher levels of density for their civilizations. One group though, opted to settle closer to their original home, on a planet that orbited a sun within the local star cluster. These were the souls that had been the most deeply traumatized by the slaughter of their people and couldn't long endure the hardships of a life of space travel. They developed tribal societies with strict taboos against developing any technology more advanced than handcrafted items. It would be hundreds of millions of years before they developed interstellar travel, and by the time they did, this branch of the ancient Lyrans had evolved into a race with feline features. Side note: all felines that live on our planet originated in the Lyran system. By the time that all of the children of Lyra had reached their respective planets and developed into distinct races and civilizations with different levels of technology and consciousness, many had forgotten about each other and about their common ancestral history. Those that settled soonest though, they remembered in myth and song their time in the Garden of Eden and how they were put to flight by the invading serpent. The only ones who remembered the details of what really happened were those whom had already fully developed and integrated their light bodies at the time of the invasion, the ascended masters, the souls of the Paatal, the architects of our corner of the multiverse. Many of them stayed with the ships and the newly settled planets as teachers and spiritual advisors, some incarnated into various developing races, while others journeyed throughout the universe and explored new stars and planets, including our own. They found Earth to be a jewel of a planet and delighted in its ecosystems, but they also found that it had already been discovered by another race, the Draco. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy, and on our planet that are relevant to our current situation. To go to the main publication page, click here and scroll to the bottom to start at the beginning. 365. 3. Spirituality. Extraterrestrial life. Ancient history. Bible storytelling. 365. 3. Seth. A History of the Multiverse. Follow. Written by Seth 801 followers. Editor 4. A History of the Multiverse. Intergalactic Trauma Specialist. More from Seth in A History of the Multiverse. Chapter 5, Part 1. The Golden Age of Atlantis and MU. Seth. In A History of the Multiverse. Chapter 5, Part 1. The Golden Age of Atlantis and MU. 75,000 Ya. This time on Earth was the age of the highest peak of civilization so far experienced on our planet. A time of technologies far. 9 minutes read. August 31, 2017. 345. Chapter 3, Part 2. The War in Heaven, the Corruption of Utopia, and the Maledeck Mars War. Seth. In A History of the Multiverse. Chapter 3, Part 2. The War in Heaven, the Corruption of Utopia, and the Maledeck Mars War. In order to understand the war in heaven, we first have to establish both what is meant by heaven, and who and what the principal players. The Draco fleet was always on the move. Always expanding. They were ceaselessly searching for new planets to turn into the vast farms and mining colonies that they needed to feed their race, and to build and maintain ships, weapons, and all the rest of their enormous infrastructure. 365 million Ya, two Draco brothers, piloting a scout ship of the Reptilian fleet, stumbled across our very own Earth. They determined that our Earth would be a very good candidate for a livestock planet. It had enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to be livable for their race, although the Siakar would do a few things later on to pump these levels up, and it was in a rich, primordial state where there was currently no competition, or existing predators to prey on their livestock. There was one problem though, there was no tidal system, something that is crucial for the rapid evolution of life. In order to establish a tidal system which would bring life out of the oceans and establish better conditions for the flourishing of land creatures, and also because it would make an excellent observation post, the Siakar imported, and placed in a precise orbit, a hollowed-out planetoid that we know very well. The more modern science learns about the moon, the less they can explain its existence. There are various theories in the mainstream, all of which are fraught with holes, none of which can explain all the strange things observed about the moon. Among the various baffling facts are these. The moon is much bigger than it should be. With a diameter that is 27% the size of the Earth, it is far bigger than any other observable planetary satellite in our solar system, the biggest of which is only 5% the size of its parent planet. The moon is much lighter than it should be, given its size. The mathematics of the placement of the moon, in relationship to the Earth and Sun, are fantastically precise. It is placed in exactly the perfect place to help sustain life through its influence on the tides, and the fact that it is the perfect size to completely eclipse the Sun is a mathematical impossibility unless you factor in intelligent design. Its rotation is perfectly synchronized with the Earth's, so that we only ever see one side of it, meaning it rotates on its axis once every 27. 3 days, and also orbits the Earth once every 27. 3 days. It appears to be hollow. Data indicates that its internal density is far less than its external density, and seismic equipment has shown clearly that, upon being impacted, the moon literally rings like a giant gong. This was first observed during the Apollo missions when the command module crashed into the moon, and it has been tested repeatedly by NASA since then. One of the NASA scientists involved in these tests, Ken Johnston, had this to say: the moon not only rang like a bell, but the whole moon wobbled in such a precise way that it was almost as though it had gigantic hydraulic damper struts inside it. Underneath the accumulated space dust on the surface, the moon is made largely out of metal. Countless pieces of evidence from independent astronomers and NASA scientists has shown that there are dense layers of metal beneath the surface, including pure iron and pure titanium, so pure that they could not have formed under natural conditions, chromium, and yttrium. Also, the floors of the craters on the moon are convex, not concave as you would expect, and the craters themselves are way too shallow for their width. This shallow crater with a convex floor would be the result of an asteroid blasting the surface dust off of a rigid metal sphere. Then there are other craters which scientists have been unable to find the bottom of, which are believed to be entrances into the interior. Strange lights and objects have been recorded on our moon for thousands of years. The classical Greek philosopher, mathematician and scientist, Plato, reported anomalous lights on the moon sometime around 400 BC. In 1787, legendary astronomer, Sir William Herschel, recorded strange lights traveling across the dark lunar surface. Every single NASA mission to the moon has involved encounters with UFOs and observations of colossal artificial structures on the dark side, which have been covered up by NASA, the photographs airbrushed, but which many astronauts have since come forward with first-person accounts of. I'll stop there, but there are many other, unexplained, facts about the moon. Of course, all of these mysteries are resolved by accepting the fact that the moon is an artificially constructed metal object that was brought here from elsewhere. As Occam's razor states, the simplest answer is usually the truth, no matter how strange it may seem. The moon was the first base of operations for the Draco, and it has been conquered, reconquered, upgraded and repurposed many times since then by different races that have had an interest in our system. In our present time, the moon serves as a command center for this entire arm of the Milky Way, a demilitarized zone with many bases, both on the surface and inside, which are inhabited by representatives from many different civilizations, even ones that have been enemies for eons. It also houses the computer system that broadcasts the artificial third-density matrix onto the Earth. A brief overview of the next few 100 million years. I'm going to cover a huge span here because, frankly, I just have to do that some in this story or it would be a quadrillion pages long. There were obviously countless dramas and wars and discoveries, rises and falls in consciousness, etc. During such a long time span, so this next bit is painted in very broad strokes. 300 million ya. Thanks to the draconian breeding programs in cooperation with the helpful forces of evolution, the first reptiles begin to emerge on Earth. 252 million ya. The Permian-Triassic extinction event. The Earth's atmosphere is starting to have a higher percentage of oxygen than the Draco desire, and their various breeding programs are beginning to spin out of control as the rich environment of the Earth and the forces of evolution support the propagation of many, many species. The Draco scientists crash an asteroid into the planet in order to bump up CO2 levels in the atmosphere and also to wipe out the weaker species from their gene pool, leaving only the strongest, who will eventually evolve into the dinosaurs. 227 million ya. The dinosaurs have arrived. Many of the aggressive species, the meat-eaters, are used for crossbreeding into dinoid soldiers and slaves. While the vegetarians are left alone to evolve into larger and larger sources of protein. 200 million ya. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction event. That pesky rich plant life on Earth is yet again raising the oxygen percentage to uncomfortable levels. The Siakar hit the Earth with yet another asteroid in an attempt to wipe out the various emerging mammalian species that are competing with the dinosaurs for resources. Aware of this persistent meddling, and dedicated to nurturing all forms of life in the universe, and also because some of them were aware of the importance of the soul of Mother Earth, a branch of the Paatal, the ancient builder race, settled here at this time and built a base in the area of what is now Antarctica, the ruins of which have been excavated relatively recently. The emergence of early intergalactic civilizations. There are many well-developed intergalactic civilizations in the universe at this point. There is trading going on between the systems of Orion, Sirius, parts of Lyra and Draco, Vega and the Pleiades, and many civilizations have started to check out our local star system as well, resulting in some skirmishes with the Draco forces. Those early colonists in Lyra, who had shunned technology and formed more primitive tribal societies, as well as other races that had developed unaware of their galactic neighbors, are generally left alone by the more advanced civilizations who, for the most part, follow a policy of non-intervention. However, some of these worlds were taken over by reptilian factions who had no such scruples. The populations of these unfortunate worlds were enslaved and experimented on with genetic manipulation, much like the situation on our own world. All this diversity and evolution coupled with the genetic manipulation programs of the Draco has resulted in a profusion of breeds and cross-breeds, a cornucopia of races in the universe: human, reptilian, canine, avian, feline, amphibious, insectoid, and more. Not to mention the various races that have evolved in their consciousness to the point that they don't use any sort of physical body and exist simply as a union of love-light. Most of the reptilian races and sub-races who are not traveling through space live in or around Draco, Orion and Sirius, though they have many, many colonies and farm worlds all across the universe, including Earth. Most are still androgynous, yet because of the emergence of such incredible genetic variation some are now sexed. Most are still self-serving and aggressive, but some have DNA that has been altered enough to enable them to develop spiritually and are neutral, or even benevolent. The Alpha Draco'S branch in particular have evolved quite a bit, and many have increased their vibration to a 5D state and joined in brotherhood with other 5D races. From 200 million years ago to about 22 million years ago, our universe was, in general, a place of thriving development in culture, arts, trade, science and spirituality. In a time span that vast there were, of course, countless ups and downs, wars, atrocities, and struggles, but you could say that the overall trend was one relative peace. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy, and on our planet that are relevant to our current situation. To go to the main publication page, click here and scroll to the bottom to start at the beginning. 326. Science. Moon. Extraterrestrial life. Draconian. 326. Seth. A History of the Multiverse. Follow. Written by Seth. 801 followers. Editor 4. A History of the Multiverse. Intergalactic Trauma Specialist. More from Seth in A History of the Multiverse. Chapter 5, Part 1. The Golden Age of Atlantis and MU. Seth. Seth. In A History of the Multiverse. Chapter 5, Part 1. The Golden Age of Atlantis and MU. 75,000 Ya. This time on Earth was the age of the highest peak of civilization so far experienced on our planet. A time of technologies far. 9 minutes read. August 31, 2017. 345. Chapter 3, Part 2. The War in Heaven, the Corruption of Utopia, and the Maledeck Mars War. Seth. Seth. In A History of the Multiverse. Chapter 3, Part 2. The War in Heaven, the Corruption of Utopia, and the Maledeck Mars War. In order to understand the war in heaven, we first have to establish both what is meant by heaven, and who and what the principal players. 11 minutes. 100 million Ya. The group of ascended masters, also known as the Paatal, the founders, the builder race, and by this point many other names, who had set up a base in the area we now call Antarctica, were monitoring the Draco farming and breeding programs that were currently underway. Eventually, these ascended masters decided that having Earth controlled and inhabited almost exclusively by reptiles wasn't in alignment with the overall unfolding of destiny that needed to occur in our little corner of the multiverse, which led to 65 million years ago, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. Using gravitic technology, they essentially lassoed an oxygen-rich comet that was passing by at the time and crashed it into the Earth. The devastation of this impact led to the extinction of the dinosaurs and put an end to the use of our Earth as a livestock farm by the Draco, although they are still around today and the Earth is now a very different kind of farm, but we'll get to that later. The Draco presence was withdrawn from the planet, with the exception of a small group of negative Siakar royalty whom descended underground. The Siakar command also set up domed cities on Venus, in order to have another base in the area, and of course they still had their cities on, and in, the Moon. On Earth, once the dust had settled, the atmosphere was more oxygen-rich and more suitable for the co-evolution of both mammals and reptiles, which was more in line with what the Ascended Masters saw as this planet's destiny. They reseeded the Earth with the genetic material of many life forms, gathered from different planets in our galaxy, and then most of them took off to other areas of the multiverse. One major branch would settle in the area of Arcturus and become those we know as the Arcturians. One group stayed behind though. They set up a fifth-density civilization on Venus, to oversee the development of life on Earth and to keep an eye on the Draco. This group was led by Lord Sanat Kumara, and they would eventually become known as the Nakals. They have played a major role in our history ever since that time. 50 million Ya. Life was developing nicely on Earth when a group of relatively civilized non-aggressive reptilian hybrids, meaning not exclusively reptilian as they also had some human DNA in the mix, from Orion and Sagittarius arrived and petitioned the Nacals for permission to establish a fifth-density civilization on the Earth. The Nacals granted their request with one condition, that they not interfere with an intelligent civilization of mammals that was currently flourishing here, the pre-cetaceans. Go look at the skeleton of a whale or dolphin, you will see that there is still a tiny residual hip bone from when they were land creatures. It's known by modern scientists that whales and dolphins are intelligent and that their ancestors walked on land, but it is not known that those ancestors were actually the first intelligent mammalian civilization on Earth. That race, the pre-cetaceans, would have a long peaceful co-evolution, and then struggle, and then eventually war, with this new group of settlers. 42 million ya. For 8 million years these two races have evolved and flourished side by side, developing to the point that there was a high level of technology and spiritual enlightenment on Earth. The pre-cetaceans lived close to the Earth, focusing on an agricultural lifestyle and working on evolving their spiritual and psychic abilities. The Reptoids were more interested in technology and the two cultures traded to mutual advantage. The technological advancements of the Reptoids made for increased efficiency in the pre-cetaceans' farming practices, and the Reptoids received food and also lessons in spiritual development for those few of that race that were so inclined. All was going along quite well for a long time, but eventually that old enemy of the mammalian form, the race of pure-blooded negative Siakar, who had gone into a long hibernation underground, woke up, and they didn't like what they saw happening on the world above. They began to make contact with their reptoid cousins on the surface and did their best to sow seeds of resentment towards the pre-cetaceans, resentment that the reptoids were predisposed towards anyway, due to their genetic heritage. The reptoids had always been subconsciously envious of, and sometimes outwardly hostile towards the pre-cetaceans' proficiency with psychic abilities, a proficiency that some of the reptoids did manage to develop, but only a very few. It took a long time, but eventually the Siakar poisoned the culture of the reptoid civilization to the point that they began to mistrust, and then turn on the pre-cetaceans. Eventually this friction led to war between the two groups, or rather, it would have led to war, if the pre-cetaceans had not preempted it. The more advanced beings among that race, the leaders who had developed the ability to step outside of the stream of time and see the past and probable future, saw this coming long before it actually happened, and they had set their course in motion thousands of years before the war actually began. They selected a portion of their race to begin undergoing gene mutation, evolving rapidly into a species that could live in the oceans of the Earth, so that their presence on the planet could be maintained after the inevitable conflict which they foresaw. When the Reptoids launched their attack, even though they were a much more aggressive and technologically advanced race, they really didn't stand a chance. Even nuclear and scalar weapons, both of which the Reptoids possessed, were no match for the power of the pre-cetacean consciousness, a group mind that could manipulate matter itself. The ocean-dwelling pre-cetaceans were well established at this point, so when the Reptoids attacked, the land-dwelling pre-cetaceans took to their interstellar ships, the technology for which had been, ironically, developed alongside the Reptoids in more peaceful times. Once the pre-cetacean race was off-planet with their cousins safely underwater, they used their group mind to penetrate the Reptoids' incredibly powerful fusion reactors. A little mental nudge is all that was required to implode the reactors, resulting in nuclear explosions that decimated 98% of the Reptoid population. The 2% who survived fled to Maledeck, also called Tiamat, a planet that used to be part of our solar system but which now is our asteroid belt. Not a very spiritually advanced choice on the part of the supposedly evolved pre-cetaceans, you might say. But here is a hard truth. Even those who have progressed to advanced states of consciousness, when confronted with either the destruction of their race or another, will often choose self-preservation. Besides, there was more at stake than their own survival. There was the Earth herself to think about. The pre-cetaceans might still have chosen simply to flee. Many were in favor of that, but if they had fled they would have left the planet in the claws of the increasingly aggressive Reptoids, who might very well have recommenced terraforming operations, working to once again make the atmosphere suitable only to the flourishing of reptiles, which was not in alignment with the destiny of Earth. The wise ones of the pre-Cetaceans looked down many time streams and consulted with Lord Sanat Kumara and the Nakals on Venus, and in the end all were in agreement that this path was the one that would lead to the best possible outcome for the most beings. When you have only hard choices, you have to sometimes choose the best hard choice. Now that they had rid the Earth of the aggressive, war-minded reptilians, mostly that is, the ones underground, were still alive and kicking, the pre-Cetaceans, now the Cetaceans, could establish a safe haven for the flourishing of their offspring, who would become our present-day whales and dolphins, who still perform a very important service for our planet. Their group consciousness has held the memory of our Earth since that time, and they have preserved that genetic memory though times when our planet's consciousness field has collapsed, resulting in a total wiping out of the planet's Akashic memory banks, the information of all lives ever lived on a particular planet, stored in that planet's electromagnetic gravitic field. Whales and dolphins act as an external hard drive. From time to time when our Earth's memory banks have been corrupted or wiped out, the Cetaceans have been there to upload the backup. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy, and on our planet that are relevant to our current situation. To go to the main publication page, click here and scroll to the bottom to start at the beginning. 222. Extraterrestrial life. Ancient history. Cetaceans. Reptoids. 222. Seth. A History of the Multiverse. Follow. Written by Seth. 801 followers. Editor 4. A History of the Multiverse. Intergalactic Trauma Specialist. More from Seth in A History of the Multiverse. Chapter 5, Part 1. In order to understand the war in heaven, we first have to establish both what is meant by heaven, and who and what the principal players actually were. In popular mythology, heaven is often envisioned as a place of billowy white clouds and streaming sunlight, and sure, it could look like that if the inhabitants desired. In fact, it could look like anything. Heaven simply means the sixth and seventh densities. The inhabitants of these realms are the divine archetypes, simplified by many with the term God. Divinity actually exists as four distinct yet inextricably bound forces: the masculine and feminine principles, heart, Christ, energy, and body. The archangels and angels. These are immortal manifestations of the divine. Eternal beings of light with vast intelligence and power. The ascended masters. Incarnates who have ascended to the sixth density and act as great guides and teachers for all creation. Lucifer was the brightest of the archangels, but he had a huge chip on his shoulder. If you want to know why, read the Lucifer appendix here. He wasn't on board with the idea of everything moving towards unity and oneness, which is the plan of divinity and overall destiny of the multiverse, because he feared that this would lead to no individuality. He didn't understand that he could be one with everything and also retain his uniqueness, and I'm pretty sure that this is also due to the wound at the center of his creation. Again, see the Lucifer appendix. What he actually feared was becoming one with his creator, because it would mean having to resolve his core trauma, something that's scary for anyone. To be fair, divinity didn't understand at this point the responsibility it had in forming this trauma in the first place. 4. 5 millennia. This conflict reached a head and erupted into the war in heaven, with Lucifer and the host of angels he had managed to persuade, about 1/3 of them, on one side, and Archangel Michael leading the rest of the heavenly forces against him. The mother and father didn't take sides, because one of the fundamental tenets of this creation is that free will and its resulting consequences must be allowed to play out, no matter how disastrous they may seem at the time. Long story short, Lucifer lost. He and all those who had sided with him were kicked out of heaven, meaning that Michael essentially lassoed the light bodies of the rebels and beamed them down through the densities, through space and time, to our solar system. It was thought that these fallen angels could learn some valuable lessons from the limitations and solidity of fifth density reality, so the energy beam that carried them here contained coding written to bind the rebels to the fifth density. It worked with the angels. They were locked into the fifth density as monstrous, rocky creatures. But Lucifer was an archangel, possessing more energy than the lesser angels. He was able to take strength from the earth and form a shield that broke and deflected the beam. He was able to deflect enough coating that he retained some of his psychic and interdensity abilities, and he was able to manifest a body for himself, incarnate into a body, or to simply exist as conscious energy. He has since incarnated many times, as a member of the Anunnaki, as a player in the 13 royal bloodlines, and as a human, and through his myriad trials and lessons he has since been redeemed and exists now as a great archangel of unconditional love, a rescuer and redeemer of those unjustly banished to hell. This is kind of ironic, as so many people who worship Lucifer as a dark god are totally unaware that he is no longer that, and that the entity they are actually giving their energy to is Ahriman and his demon gods such as Baal, Baphomet, and Moloch. But at the time, when Lucifer and his followers were banished to our system, the effect of that huge bundle of archetypal energy having its density greatly lowered as it passed through our solar system was much like the effect of cornstarch in gravy. Our little region of space-time began to thicken. This paved the way for the demonic energy of Ahriman and his asuras to penetrate our little corner of the multiverse more intensely with their vibration. Utopia, our lovely Earth and her surrounding community of peaceful planets, began its long, slow descent into corruption and darkness, a low point that we are just starting to climb our way out of today. 5 million Ya. Over the course of these 3 million years the vibration of our solar system gradually slowed and Utopia slowly sickened, and so it was during this time that a group who had a big grudge against the two most densely populated planets in our system, Maldek and Mars, saw their opportunity to return. 5 million Ya. The group of 13 royal bloodlines from Orion, the souls that were previously kicked out of our system for being too dark and violent during the time of Utopia, settled on Maldek and began to influence and quicken the decline of that planet's consciousness grid. That planet's people, who were already on a downward slide, and many of whom were from the defeated reptoid lineage who had fled there from Earth long ago, were easily seduced by the dark men from Orion and quickly embraced their ideals of service to self, technology and control, giving up their freedom in attempt to gain some sense of power over their deteriorating circumstances, but the yearning for that type of power and control is a vicious cycle that only leads to wanting more. They started to become belligerent and then downright threatening towards their peaceful Martian neighbors, eventually insisting that Mars surrender its territory to Maldakian control voluntarily, or they would be conquered, colonized and possibly wiped out. Some of the citizens of Mars appealed to their relatives in the Pleiades for aid, and the Pleadians answered by sending a fleet of ships to help out. Ironically, Maldek took the arrival of the Pleiadian fleet as a provocation, and used it to justify their attack on Mars. Using electromagnetic gravitic technology, essentially a tech-generated Merkaba field, the Maldakians created an energy grid around their planet that could be used as both a shield and as a weapon against the Martians' natural, created solely with group consciousness Merkaba shield. By using this weapon, Maldek was able to disrupt the Martian energy grid enough to bombard the planet with poisonous chemical bombs, causing chain reactions in the atmosphere that turned the air into a toxic fume. This happened very rapidly and most of the Martians died before they knew what hit them. Many of these souls returned to Sirius and the Pleiades, while others who were too traumatized to access that vibration hovered around Earth, waiting to incarnate. The most evolved Martians, a group made up mostly of those original souls who had settled on Mars during the Orion Wars, were able to escape in their light bodies. In retaliation, the Pleiadian fleet surrounded Maldek and bombarded it with energy beams that began to destabilize the Maldek energy shield. Panicking, the Orion leaders of Maldek cranked up the power of their grid in an attempt to take out the entire Pleiadian fleet in one big energy burst, but their plan backfired. Passing an increased current through the damaged tech-based energy field destabilized the natural electromagnetic gravitic grid of the planet so much that Maldek was shattered into bits, becoming the asteroid belt now located between Mars and Jupiter. The very souls of the deceased inhabitants of Maldek were shattered as well by the trauma of their entire planet being suddenly ripped apart. Each soul there was shredded into many soul fragments, each still capable of consciousness, but with a fraction of the energy of their original selves. They flocked to Earth, now the safest, most hospitable planet in the system, and joined the souls of the Martians there, hovering around the planet in a great cloud of soul families, waiting to incarnate. Many of the people on Earth now were part of that group. Seconds before the planet was torn apart, the group of 13 royal bloodlines who made up the leadership of the Orion faction, and who were well prepared for just such an eventuality, managed to escape into space-time using their electromagnetic gravitic technology. They traveled in 3 gigantic, disc-shaped motherships, battered and damaged from the wars, to a place and time where they saw that it would be both possible and advantageous to manifest, to Atlantis, approximately 52,000 years before our present day. The Pleadians, though, saw what they were up to. They were too battered and weary from the war though, and not able or inclined to pursue them through space-time, so they came up with another solution. They imposed an artificial third-density matrix onto the planet by setting up an advanced digital computer system, powered by 12 nuclear generators, in the spaceship we call the Moon, which projected a holographic egg-shaped matrix around the Earth. This third-density matrix, which we are still living in today, is a superimposed holographic overlay on 5D Earth, a lower-frequency caricature of 5D reality. Now, you might be wondering how a holographic projection can keep anyone trapped, but it is so because these holograms are not just light. They are so powerful that they form an electromagnetic force field, the Van Allen belt. You cannot pass that force field without technology that can manipulate frequency, or by developing your consciousness enough that you can raise your physical vibration to match the 5D frequency. The Pleiadians looked down the timeline and saw that this third-density matrix would already be in place when the Orion group emerged from spacetime in their damaged ships, which further damaged their equipment to the point that they lost the technology to manipulate frequency, and their consciousness was not sufficiently evolved to access that frequency without technological assistance, so therefore the Orion group would be trapped on third-density Earth and would not be able to escape. That way, the Pleiadians figured, they could take their time to go home, recover and check back on the situation later. This third-density matrix also had the added benefit of more closely matching the frequency of the traumatized souls of Maldek and Mars, who were hovering around Earth waiting to incarnate. The 13 royal bloodlines from Orion have played a major role in our planet's history ever since that time. They eventually joined with the Draco, who had been hibernating underground, and together, along with the Jesuits, also called the Illuminati, and a certain German political party they would meet much later on, they would form the core of the group that today we have come to call the Cabal. These dark men from Orion, these 13 royal bloodlines, all had elongated skulls, which you can see appear prominently in Egyptian and other post-flood cultures. This group, and their elongated skulls, can be traced to the Roman Empire, the Vatican, and European royalty, many of whom also had elongated skulls, though over time their skulls have gotten smaller as their physiology reacted and adapted to the energy, gravity and DNA of the planet. Some of the Pleiadians have since regretted their part in the destruction of Maldek and have been trying to help us out since then, resulting in the many present-day channelers who speak for different beings there, and the many starseeds from there who choose to incarnate on Earth. That positive faction of Pleiadians are also part of the efforts currently underway to move us out of the third density matrix, though most are not aware of the necessary role the third density plays in allowing us to interface with the mother wound, and that the process cannot be rushed, for we must bring all those lost pieces of the mother with us into the fifth density in order for any evolution or ascension process to integrate and stick. For more about this, read parts 1 and 2 of the preface, if you have not already. 2. 5 million Ya. Our neighborhood was in trouble, as the low vibe that now permeated our system made it more possible for nasty beings of all types to take up residence. The Earth had been designated a living library, home to flora and fauna from across the galaxy, but that's not the only thing that makes her special. The spirit of the Earth is the largest, most sentient piece of the lost original mother. Because of this, our little blue planet is an energetic linchpin for all of creation, so there was very real reasons for concern among the higher forces of light. Sanat Kumara, the leader of 144,000 Nakals who were still in residence on 5th density Venus, decided it was time to return to Earth for a while to help stabilize the situation. Artistic depiction of Lord Sanat Kumara. He traveled here with 400 of his people and together they manifested a 5D city above the Gobi Sea, which is now the Gobi Desert. This city would become known as the White City, or Shambhala. Once Shambhala was established, the rest of the Nakals made the trip from Venus and took up residency. Foreseeing that they would be involved with nurturing all forms of life on the planet for a long time to come, Sanat Kumara decided that a 4D city should be constructed underground, directly below Shambhala, so a portion of the Nakals manifested some 4D bodies so that they could interface with the 4th density reality on Earth, and began construction of lower Shambhala. The group of humans from the Pleiades who had settled here about 17.5 million years before, and who were also living at the 4th density most of Agartha as 4D territory, had already established a city underground and they welcomed the Nakals and also assisted with the construction. Then the Nakals began the real work. Together with the Pleiadian group and the more highly evolved Martians who had escaped the destruction of their planet's atmosphere in their light bodies, they began helping the traumatized souls of all those who had perished in the Maledeck Mars War, who were hovering around the Earth in a great cloud, waiting to incarnate here. These poor souls were so traumatized and fragmented. They had lost all their psychic abilities and Akashic memory and were barely sentient. They incarnated into the 3rd density matrix as primitive hominids, the genus we know as Homo habilis. The active DNA was reduced to 2 strands, with the 10 other strands existing only as potential. The different soul families, each of which was comprised of shards from a previously intact, single soul, incarnated into different tribes. Essentially, one tribe equals one soul family equals one shattered Maldakian or Martian soul. To this day, many of the souls who inhabit the Earth are from this group, and while some have evolved and healed over time, regaining much of their former spiritual prowess, others have not and are still barely above their ancient hominid ancestors in terms of consciousness. The reason that our fossil record shows so many different species of the genus Homo subsequently appearing and disappearing throughout the millions of years that follow this time is because of both evolution and continued genetic manipulation by the Nakals, as well as many other groups. In fact, descendants from these tribes would eventually be altered into Homo sapiens by the Anunnaki about 2 million years after the introduction of Homo habilis. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy, and on our planet that are relevant to our current situation. To go to the main publication page, click here and scroll to the bottom to start at the beginning. 416. 1. Extraterrestrial life. Heaven. Angels. Ancient history. Bible and its people. The origin of Nibiru and its people. 2. 5 million Ya. Around the same time that the Maledeck Mars War was erupting in our solar system, the Anunnaki were getting into some trouble over in the Orion sector. Remember back to their origin during the Orion Wars, they were created as a race from a union between the leaders of the Federation and the Empire, and from the beginning it was their mandate to be leaders as well. The fact that they were eventually rejected by the galaxy, largely because of the reptilian side of their heritage, left them with a pretty big chip on their collective shoulder. So when the Orion War finally did end and Tiamat, who has her share of reptilian DNA as well, she is called the Dragon Queen for good reason, was given governorship over both our region of space as well as Orion, the Anunnaki were righteously pissed off. This bitterness festered until, in an excess of hubris and stupidity, they launched an attack on Tiamat's home planet and were easily defeated by the much larger and more advanced forces of the Dragon Queen. Tiamat could have easily wiped out the Anunnaki, but she is both an enlightened and merciful ruler. I'm using the present tense here to refer to Tiamat because she is still around, and she magnanimously offered a peace settlement to the little warrior dwarves. Even though the Anunnaki were bigger than us, 10-14 feet tall, they were indeed dwarfed by Tiamat and her race of dragon-human hybrids who are 50 to 60 feet tall. Part of the peace treaty was a symbolic marriage between En, the leader of the Anunnaki, and Tiamat. Their genetic materials were mixed to create 12 crossbreed children, 6 male and 6 female, who were 30 to 35 feet tall and had both reptilian and humanoid attributes. These children were gifted to and to be his loyal servants, and their descendants would become the Ajiji, the giant worker race of the Anunnaki. Some of the creatures from Greek history were descended from the Ajiji, such as the Cyclops and the Hundred-Handed Ones. Over in our neck of the woods, the Maledeck Mars war was at an end, but the system was still in trouble. Up until this time, our system had actually been a binary star system, as are many solar systems that have life-sustaining planets, and this resulted in a higher vibrational state than currently exists. However, the vibration of the consciousness grid in Sol had become so lowered by the trauma of war and the destruction of Maledeck that there was a vibrational incompatibility between the consciousness of the system as a whole, and the energy of the binary suns. It was basically just too much light for the darkness of that time, and there was great danger that this dissonance could eventually lead to an imbalance great enough to cause disaster. To help correct this imbalance, for which they were partly responsible, engineers from the Pleiades arrived to help save the day. Working in the sixth density, they lowered the vibration of our second sun, siphoning off energy and plasma and using it to create two other heavenly bodies. With the raw material taken from that second sun, they built a blue dwarf star, Elenanon, rotating around it, a reddish planet with a molten core that would become known as Nibiru. These red and blue heavenly bodies would also become known as Red Kachina and Blue Kachina by the Hopi people. They set Nibiru and Elenanon in a long, elliptical orbit, swinging around the dual foci of Sol and another star far outside our solar system once every 3,600 years. Our original second sun became the planet we call Saturn. There are many myths in ancient lore about Saturn once being our sun, and it is still worshipped today as the Dark Sun by various groups. The Pleiadian engineers then crashed a couple comets into the crust of Nibiru and got some water and oxygen going, and the resulting atmosphere of Nibiru was held in by a blanket of cloud and particulate belched forth from the continuously erupting volcanoes on the surface, which also filtered the radiation from Elenanon. Though Nibiru is not a watery planet like ours, it was made so that it could support oxygen-breathing life forms. The star at its heart still generated enough heat internally that, combined with the warmth from Elenanon, it was able to support life even at its furthest point from Sol. Now all that was needed was a race of people to inhabit the planet, and it just so happened that Tiamat knew just the folks who should go there, the Anunnaki. By giving custodianship of the planet to the Anunnaki, she gave them something they wanted, governorship of our region of space, and she also got something she wanted. A nice, out-of-the-way place to put the troublesome warrior race. The Anunnaki colonized Nibiru at a time when it was still very far away from our solar system, closer to their home system of Sirius. The intention was for the Anunnaki to become a group of warrior guardians, who could keep an eye out for the kind of strife that had so recently brought our system to the brink of collapse. Unfortunately though, as a result of their mixed genetic heritage, the Anunnaki already had rifts and resentments within their own culture, rifts that had never really closed since their inception during the Orion Wars. As they traveled through space on their new home, getting closer and closer to our own solar system where the vibration had already been lowered by the casting out of Lucifer and his followers in the War of Heaven and by all the suffering and destruction of the Maledeck Mars Wars, these rifts in their culture widened into cracks. During these early days, the Anunnaki civilization on Nibiru became a culture divided against itself, with those more inclined towards their Federation roots in the north and those that leaned towards the ideals of the Empire in the south. The society at that time resembled a mix of tribal, medieval and space-age technologies, with warring royal families, castles and swords and magic, etc., as well as the various laser blasters and missiles that had survived down through the generations. They also still had many weapons of great terror, as they are referred to in the Sumerian clay tablets, which were basically nuclear warheads, the use of which was considered taboo by all the tribes. These nukes would survive down through the millennia, stored and preserved in stasis fields, and become shrouded in mysticism and myth, and some of them would eventually find their way down to our own planet, a couple million years later. By the time Nibiru swung through our planetary system for the first time, the Anunnaki were in no shape to keep an eye out for anyone but themselves, and such would be the case for many generations to come. Note: From this point on, all the history concerning the Anunnaki comes from actual recorded documents. I primarily used The Lost Book of Enki, by Zecharia Sitchin, distinguished Orientalist and biblical scholar. He is one of the few people alive who is able to read and translate the Sumerian clay tablets, among other ancient texts. The Lost Book of Enki was Mr. Sitchin's presentation of this story, which he compiled from ancient clay tablets and other artifacts unearthed in various archaeological digs. Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite, Egyptian, Canaanite and Hebrew sources are all woven together to create this narrative. Rather than detracting from the story's veracity, it is my opinion that the fact that all these various sources dovetail with each other and speak to the same events increases the likelihood that these events did, in fact, occur. Plus my gut says yes. 775,000 Ya. For more than 1.5 million years, while life on Earth has been flourishing and slowly evolving under the gentle guiding hand of the Nakals, life on Nibiru has been one of repeated cycles of war, destruction, rebuilding and then more of the same. Many cities have been built, destroyed, rebuilt and destroyed again. Civilization has risen to heights that surpass our current level of technology, and have also been plunged back into the Stone Age from devastating conflict. But finally, there was peace. In an unconscious repetition of their ancient origin as a species, the two major tribes of the Anunnaki drew by lot, one from the north, a man given the name and title, and another repetition from ancient times, and was also the name of the ancestor who made peace with Tiamat, and one from the south, a woman titled An. 2. To be their king and queen and to establish one united royal bloodline. A lot had changed in the Anunnaki culture by the time this peace was reached. They had forgotten their connection to a larger cosmic brotherhood and their origins on Nibiru had become shrouded in myth and legend. However, throughout the following several 100,000 years of peace and stability they would regain much of what they lost in terms of technology and consciousness. There were still some ancient nuclear warheads around, the weapons of great terror, stored in stasis fields, the use of which was taboo, as well as some computers and laser technology, all of which had become like holy relics, preserved and honored with ritual. Through studying these technological remnants, Anunnaki scientists were able to start progressing in the development of science and technology once again. The surrounding intergalactic community, who followed a policy of non-intervention at the time, left them to their own devices. It wouldn't be until the Anunnaki came and set up shop on Earth, many hundreds of thousands of years later, that they would be reintroduced to the knowledge of their long-lost space family through war with the Draco on the Moon, and interaction with the Nakals and Lord Sanat Kumara on Earth. But at the time, as far as they knew, they were alone in the universe. 497,000 Ya. The Anunnaki civilization was in trouble. The cold times of the planet were getting colder, and the hot times hotter, because of breaches in the thinning atmosphere of the planet. This is because the volcanoes that had been generating the particulate matter that helped to seal in the atmosphere, and filter the radiation from Elenin, were dying out. The heat from the molten core had fueled the volcanoes for a long time, but it was failing. Crops were failing too and infertility had begun to spread among the people, including the current royal couple, Duru and Dora. The chain of lineage that descended down from An 2 was broken when, instead of procreating, Duru and Dora adopted a child named Lama, who inherited the throne. In the reign of Lama, two solutions to the declining atmosphere were proposed. The first was that gold should be mined from the hammered bracelet, the asteroid belt that was once Maldek. Gold, it had been found, was the only mineral that could be ground fine enough that it would stay suspended in the atmosphere, acting as a shield. Or 2, that nuclear warheads be launched into the dormant volcanoes in an attempt to reignite their eruptions. Lama was indecisive and weak-willed though, heeding only his wife's advice that they should pray to the great creator of all, for an answer. 4 Shars, the Nibiruan year, one of which equals 3,600 Earth years, went by and the unrest in the population only grew as the deprivation and blight got worse. Eventually, disgusted by Lama's lack of action, one prince named Alalu decided to take the throne for himself. He led a band of fellow princes and soldiers who stormed the palace and Lama was thrown to his death from the highest tower by Alalu, who, incidentally, was an incarnation of Lucifer. Even though Lama was largely despised, there was much turmoil caused by the murder of the king at the hands of this usurper, and Alalu was brought before the council so that they could question him. Alalu claimed the right of kingship because he was descended from and through the firstborn son of King Anshargal. This ancestor was sired on a concubine though, and had lost his right to the throne when the law of the seed, he with the most royal genetic material inherits, supplanted the law of succession, the firstborn son inherits many shars ago during King Anshargal's reign. Alalu claimed that this implementation of the law of the seed was a cruel manipulation by Queen Kishargal, who was the king's own half-sister, a law which she pushed forward solely so that her son would inherit. It was Alalu's argument that he must inherit the land and restore the nobility of the line of An. Upon hearing this, another prince, named Anu, stepped forward, also claiming that he was descended from and through his youngest son, Anuru. He also claimed a right to the throne. There was much debate and indecision, with the council siding about half and half with each prince, but then Alalu proposed a solution. He embraced Anu as a brother and declared that they should work together as equal descendants of An. If Anu would let Alalu be king, then Alalu would make Anu the heir. They agreed and Alalu proclaimed that Anu would be his cupbearer and crown prince. To further cement their union, it was decreed that Alalu's daughter would be wed to Anu's son. Alalu became king and ordered the construction of a fleet of mining vessels, which were to bring back the badly needed gold from the asteroid belt, but he underestimated the dangers of attempting to mine gold in such perilous territory and the fleet was mostly destroyed by the hammered bracelet the asteroid belt formed from the shattered remains of Maledeck. He then tried the second solution, and ordered that some of the weapons of great terror be taken from their stasis fields and launched into the core of the volcanoes, in the hope that this might reignite their internal combustion. But this too failed and 9 long shars of Alalu's rule followed, a time of increasing discontent and suffering, during which the people of Nibiru ceased to revere the king who was failing to save them as he had promised. Finally, convinced that he must step up to save his people, Anu challenged Alalu to unarmed single combat. Both men were skilled warriors and the battle was long, but eventually Anu won, so Alalu, fearing that he would suffer the same fate as the despised Lama, whom he himself had murdered, fled out of the city to the spaceport, where he launched his ship into the stars. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy. 450,000 Ya. Alalu sped away from Nibiru, fleeing the Anunnaki territory in one of the few remaining mining ships, which was equipped with both lasers and nuclear warheads, for this was one of the ships that had been outfitted for bombing the volcanoes as well. Wanting to put as much distance between him and his former subjects as possible, he set his course for the Forbidden Zone, the area of our solar system that lay in between the asteroid belt and the Sun, forbidden because the passage through the hammered bracelet was so perilous. He kept record of his flight and recorded his impressions of Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, Saturn and Jupiter as he passed them on his way. His ship was also equipped with instruments able to detect different kinds of mineral content and, with his mind on a possible way to redeem himself among his people, he scanned these planets for the much-needed gold, but to no avail. Using some of the weapons on board his ship, he managed to blast a passageway through the asteroids, the first of his people to do so. He then passed Mars, red and desolate and also devoid of significant amounts of gold, and at last beheld Earth, named Ki by the Anunnaki, gleaming like a blue jewel in space. At this point his instruments went crazy as they detected the vast amounts of gold embedded in the planet's crust. He went closer to the planet to confirm the readings and was caught in its gravity well and, unable to pull himself out of the gravitational spiral, he descended to the surface. Using his mining equipment, he confirmed the presence of the precious metal his people so desperately needed, and it was with visions of redemption and glory in his mind that Alalu sent a message to Nibiru with his ship's transmitter, announcing his great discovery and proclaiming his right to be king once again because of it. All of this was observed with curiosity by the other intelligent inhabitants of the Earth. The Nakals, living in 5D Shambhala and in 4D Lower Shambhala, the Namlu, multi-dimensional guardians of our precious living library, and the Pleadian group, who were mostly living underground. All of these groups saw Alilu land, and picked up not only the communication back to his home planet, but also the intentions of his heart. They discerned that while he was indeed a somewhat petty and power-hungry individual, his concern for his people was genuine, so they decided to wait and see what played out and did not interfere or make their presence known to him. Back on Nibiru, upon receiving the momentous communication from Alilu, Anu called together his council. Some were inclined to ignore the message from the deposed ruler, saying that it was farce, saying that he was hiding somewhere on Nibiru. So the scientists were brought in to decode the origins of the transmission, and they confirmed that the source was from beyond the hammered bracelet. Upon hearing this, the general consensus was that if there was even the slightest chance that this news was genuine, then they must act to confirm it, but who would go? Ea, Anu's son, who was married to Alilu's daughter, Damkina, stood up and volunteered himself to lead an expedition to Ki, to find out the truth of Alilu's report, saying that he might be the best one to establish peace with Alilu, given that he was his son-in-law. In answer to the claim of rightful kingship, Anu decreed that if his report turned out to be true, if Alilu had indeed discovered gold, then Anu would travel to Ki himself and there wrestle him once again, to determine who should be the king on Nibiru. These decisions were then transmitted back to Alilu on Ki. After giving it some thought, he decided to agree to this proposal, confident that he would be able to defeat Anu if given a second chance. This set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the creation of us Homo sapiens, about 150,000 Earth years from this time. 445,000 Ya. Prince Ea and his expedition of 50 fellow Anunnaki have completed the journey to Earth and set up operations there. Aided by Alilu's description of how he blasted his way through the asteroid belt, they armed their ships with what is described in the clay tablets as a water blaster. I'm not sure what this actually was, but it seems probable that a high-pressure jet of water in the vacuum of space could be effective for moving asteroids. A lot of their technology seems to have been fueled by water, but whether that was normal water, or something else that they referred to as water, is unclear. Whatever the case, their blaster worked, for they were able to pass through and complete the journey unharmed. They used up most of their water in this effort though, and had to get more in order to complete the journey. Upon passing Mars, they noted the ice caps at the poles, and discovered that there were still some rivers and lakes on the surface. After determining that the gravitational pull of the planet was not too great as to prevent them from leaving again, they landed and restocked their water supply before continuing on their way. When they got to Earth, they splashed down in the waters of the Persian Gulf and were greeted there by Alilu. Over the following months and years they slowly settled in and explored the area, but the adaptation to their new home wasn't easy. To them, the Earth had insanely short day and year cycles. There is record of the Anunnaki being terrified by the first sunrise they saw, never before having seen the sun appear so huge and red on the horizon. Eventually they established the first Anunnaki city of Eridu, in the region that is now known as Iraq, and Alilu was given command of this territory, although for the time being, Ea still had command of the overall mission. As for the gold extraction, their first idea was to try extracting the metal from the waters of the region, a much easier process than mining gold from the ground and one that could be achieved solely through the use of machines, but they did not end up with much gold to show for their effort. Nevertheless, it was decided that what they had collected should be sent back to Nibiru as proof that there was indeed gold to be had, and so that the efficacy of using Earth's gold as a suspended particulate matter in Nibiru's atmosphere could be confirmed. A pilot named Abgal was chosen to fly the gold back to the home planet in Alilu's old ship, and upon inspecting the ship for his upcoming journey, Abgal discovered a couple nukes in portable stasis fields remaining in the ship's hold. He reported this to Ea and together they hid the weapons of great terror in a cave high in the mountains, after which Ea, who wasn't sure if all his kin and crew should be aware of the weapons' existence, asked Abgal not tell anyone about the nukes. Then Abgal returned to Nibiru, where testing confirmed that the gold from Earth could indeed be suspended in the atmosphere. Since extracting gold from the water was proving to be frustratingly inefficient, Ea went looking for a good location to set up mining operations. He skimmed the land in one of the mining ships, its sensors tuned to pick up traces of the precious metal in what is now called North Africa. He hit the jackpot. Deep underground there were vast quantities of gold. He returned to Eridu and began the process of transferring men and equipment to the location, which he named Abzu. The timing of his discovery was auspicious, for Nibiru was passing relatively close to the Earth at the time, and Alu, the heir apparent and Aya's older half-brother, had decided to make a trip to our planet to see his little brother and to inspect operations. Upon arrival, Alu was greeted by Aya with news of the great find in Africa, and he rejoiced and congratulated his half-brother, but he was also someone who had trouble taking the backseat, and honestly, was somewhat of a prick, and he started making plans, even though the mission was under Aya's command. Alu was inspired by the vast amounts of gold under the ground and figured that if it was there, then there must be more elsewhere. He had the idea to establish similar mining camps across the globe. He also had the idea to bring some of the Ajiji, the giant worker race of the Anunnaki, to Earth in order to assist with mining. The Ajiji, descendants of the original 12 genetically engineered crossbreed, children, of An and Tiamat, were indeed valuable workers. There had been many interesting mutations in this race over the millenniums, both through evolution and genetic manipulation on the part of the Anunnaki scientists, which gave them a great variety of forms. Some had the torsos of humanoids which flowed down into a giant serpent's body instead of legs. Or humanoid legs with many serpentine tentacle-like arms. These creatures would become known in Greek myth as the Gigantes, the Cyclops, the hundred-handed ones. They were incredibly strong, 20 to 30 feet tall, and loyal to their masters, making them ideal workers. Imagining the vast amount of gold potentially available on this planet and with his head filled with dreams of vast mining operations, Alu got so caught up in his plans that he forgot that this was not actually his mission to command. When Aya gently asserted that, while the ideas were good ones, this was actually his mission, Alu reacted poorly. He was, after all, the heir and used to having his way, and again, prickish, but still, his angry rebuttal of Aya's assertion was out of line and the argument escalated. It got pretty ugly, but eventually they managed to agree on summoning their father to settle it. This was the beginning of a rivalry between these half-brothers that would literally grow to biblical proportions. And so the King Anu made his first visit to Earth, firstly, to determine the role of each of his sons in the new colony, and second, to make good on his promise to once again meet Alalu in single combat to determine who would be the rightful king of the Anunnaki on Nibiru. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy, and on our planet that are relevant to our current situation. To go to the main publication page, click here and scroll to the bottom to start at the beginning. 222. Extraterrestrial life. Anunnaki. Gold mining. Ancient history. Ancient origins. 222. Seth. A history of the multiverse. Follow. Written by Seth. 801 followers. Editor 4. A history of the multiverse. Intergalactic trauma specialist. More from Seth in a Note. At this point you may be asking yourself, what's with all the focus on the Anunnaki? Aren't there many other races out there that we could look at? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, there are millions of races of ETs, if not billions, and of that multitude 22 have contributed to our DNA over time, but the Anunnaki have played a very significant role in our history and culture as Homo sapiens and have also made their way into the mythologies of many cultures. They were gods and goddesses of ancient Sumer and Babylon, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mayan and Inca cultures, and more. We'll get more into other races a bit later, but right now I really want to tell the story of how our particular species culture was formed. 445,000 Ya. Alu and Aya both claimed the right to be in charge of the gold mining mission on Earth. Alu was the eldest and the heir, yet Aya had gotten here before him and had been the one to get gold extraction operations up and running, so Anu decided that the fairest way to settle this was by a simple drawing of lots. Alu won the draw and Anu named him Enlil, Lord of the Sky, Lord of Command, who would eventually become known as Zeus, among other names, and gave him overall command of the Earth mission. He was in charge of operations on land and in the sky, which mostly included the development of other mining operations and overseeing the orbiting stations that would be established for processing and transport. Ea was given the name Enki, Lord of the Waters. He would eventually become known as Poseidon, among other names, and it was decided that he would continue to oversee the existing mining operations that he had already established in Abzu and would have command over any future operation that might take place in the waters of Earth. Then there was the matter of Allelu to settle, who still claimed right of kingship, and who, now that Enlil and Enki had been given command of operations on Earth, had even more resentment and anger built up against Anu. The two stripped naked and once again engaged each other in a long contest until, for the second time, Anu pinned Allelu to the ground. When Anu released him and stood up, Allelu, seething with shame and fury, leapt up and bit off Anu's penis. There is some debate as to whether this literally happened, or if this is symbolism. It could be taken to mean that by discovering the gold on Earth, which resulted in both of Anu's sons settling down here and becoming highly involved in the affairs of Earth and humans for thousands and thousands of years, that Allelu interrupted the king's lineage on Nibiru, biting off his seed. Either way, it's fair to say that Allelu did not take his defeat well and that he either enacted this terrible revenge against Anu, or claimed that he would get even in some way, for there is clear record that a council of 7 was then assembled to determine his punishment. Here is a record of that trial, as translated by Zechariah Sitchin. To die in exile, let this be the judgment. Anu was saying. In amazement the judges at each other glanced. What Anu was saying they wondered. Neither on earth nor on Nibiru shall the exiling be. Anu was saying. On the way there is the Lamu planet, with waters and an atmosphere it is endowed. Quote. He is referring here to Mars, which did indeed still possess water and an atmosphere at the time, although the atmosphere was thinning as the water continued its slow evaporation on most of the planet, while freezing at the poles. Enki, as Ea, thereon made a pause, of it as a way station have I been thinking. Its net force is less than that of Earth forceful, an advantage and wisdom to be considered. In the celestial chariot Allelu shall be taken, on my departing from Earth he with me shall make the journey. Anu then was saying. Around the planet Lamu we shall make circuits, to Allelu a sky chamber we shall provide, to the planet Lamu in it he will be descended. Alone on a strange planet and exile he shall be, his days to his last day by himself to count. Thus did Anu words of judgment utter, in solemnity were the words intended. And so Allelu's fate was decided. Remember too, Allelu was an incarnation of Lucifer, so the tendency to get banished or exiled was pretty strong in his karmic makeup, echoes of his banishment from heaven long ago. Then one of the pilots, Anzu, spoke up and volunteered to accompany Allelu to Mars and to stay with him there, so that he could bury him as befits royalty when he died. This was agreed upon and Anu told him that the next time a ship passed by the planet they would stop and check in on them, and that if Anzu was still alive he would be given command of the way station that would eventually be built there. Then Anu returned to his rule on Nibiru, dropping off Allelu and Anzu on Mars along the way, and mining operations on Earth began in earnest. 400,000 Ya. There were now 7 functional settlements in southern Mesopotamia and the overall area was named Din, Eden. These settlements included a spaceport, Sapar, Mission Control Center, Nippur, and a metallurgical center, Shuruppak. Ninmah, Enlil's lover and half-sister, the Anunnaki didn't have the same incest taboos that we have, had arrived on Earth with a group of other female nurses, bringing with them seeds to begin growing some medicinal plants. She told Enlil of the birth of their illegitimate son, Ninurta, who was still back home on Nibiru. An interesting side note, on their way to Earth Ninmah and her crew had stopped by Mars to replenish their water and there they discovered Anzu, apparently dead. But Ninmah was greatly skilled in the arts of healing and she detected that there was still a spark of life that could be rekindled. Here is an account of what then transpired, again translated from the Sumerian clay tablets by Mr. Sitchin. Ninmah touched his face, to his heart she gave attention. From her pouch she took out the pulsar, upon Anzu's heart pulsing she directed. From her pouch she took out the emitter, its crystal's life-giving emissions on his body she directed. 60 times did Ninmah direct the pulsar, 60 times the emitter she directed. On the 60th time Anzu his eyes opened, with lips he motioned. Gently upon his face Ninma water of life poured, his lips with it wetting. Gently into his mouth the food of life she placed. Then the miracle did happen. Anzu from the dead arose. Once Anzu had recovered, Ninma inquired about the disgraced Alalu, and Anzu told her of his fate. He led them to the cave where his body now lay and along the way told them the story of how Alalu had slowly sickened and then died. Ninma was greatly moved upon seeing his bones laying there desolate in the cave, for even though he had betrayed Anu, it was the first time in their history that one who had been a king on Nibiru had died on another planet, far from home. And then, inspired by her compassion, she directed the construction of a memorial that we can still see today. Here again is the translation. He who once on Nibiru was a king, was a pile of bones in a cave now lying. For the first time in our annals, a king not on Nibiru has died, not on Nibiru was he buried. So did Ninma say. Let him in peace for eternity rest. She was saying. They the cave's entrance again with stones covered. The image of Alalu upon a great rock mountain with beams they carved. They showed him wearing an eagle's helmet, his face they made uncovered. The face on Mars, as taken by the Viking orbiter in 1970. By the time Ninma arrived on Earth Enki had quite the mining operation in the Abzu, and there were other sites being explored and developed by Enlil. The ores were mined by both Anunnaki and Ajiji, and transported to Shurupik for processing. The refined metal was then sent aloft to orbiting stations manned by Ajiji, then transferred to spaceships arriving periodically from Mars. A few years later there was a way station on Mars, manned by Ajiji and Anunnaki workers under the command of the revived Anzu, where the big ships from Nibiru loaded up. Throughout the following thousands of years, Enki and Enlil were both on Earth, overseeing operations, and having many children by multiple Anunnaki partners. At one point Enlil was disgraced and exiled for raping one of Ninma's young nurses, Sud, to whom he had taken a fancy. Abgal, the pilot who was assigned to fly Enlil to his place of exile was loyal to him though and, despite Enki's previous urgings to not reveal the existence of the nukes to anyone, he took him to the location where they were hidden. Abgal encouraged Enlil to use the nukes to take back his rule, but then something else happened that made Enlil's return necessary anyway. Sud had discovered that she was pregnant by Enlil and reported her condition to Ninma, who discussed it with Enki and together they convened a council of 7. Just as Enlil was considering the possibilities that these nukes had opened up for him, he was contacted by the council and told to return to Din to face them, where he was given the chance to end his banishment by marrying Sud. He agreed and Sud was made his wife and given the title, Ninlil. At this point the main players of the Sumerian and Akkadian mythology were all here. Enlil and Ninlil, Ninma, also known as Ninhursag, and Enki. Anu was said to dwell in the heavens and indeed he did, for he stayed on Nibiru most of the time. On the other side of the world, another culture was at a more primitive stage of development. Its population, made up primarily of Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalensis, were overseen and protected by the unseen hand of the Nakals and the Namlu'u, and lived a relatively peaceful hunter-gatherer lifestyle in many areas of Asia, and were slowly spreading into the vast network of archipelagos in the Pacific that would become known as Lemuria, though that was a name given to the land and culture much later. The actual name of the culture and land that would develop there was Mu. Interspersed throughout this territory and others there were pockets of higher-level civilization formed by those members of the Pleadian group still on the surface, and these people were protected and kept isolated from other groups by the elite caste living underground. The Anunnaki High Command was aware of the primitive cultures in Mu, as well as other early hominids that roamed the plains of Mesopotamia and Africa, but considered them little more than animals. However Enki, ever the inquisitive scientist, had taken to observing and capturing various forms of native life in order to examine their DNA. The Anunnaki had possessed genetic manipulation for hundreds of thousands of years at this point, and here was a new planet with unique genetic codes that sparked his curiosity. This curiosity, combined with a revolt among the Anunnaki workers, would lead to the creation of a brand new species, us. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy, and on our planet that are relevant to our current situation. To go to the main public 250,000 Ya. 5 cities have been perfected in the Din. They are Eridu, Larsa, Lagash, Shurubik, and Nibru-Ki. Enki has built a towering palace in Eridu, and is settled there with his wife, Damkina, and their son, Marduk. In the city of Nibru-Ki, Enlil has constructed a massive observation tower, the Bond Heaven-Earth, which was equipped with all sorts of radar, scanning, and telecommunications equipment that linked up with all the satellites in orbit, as well as the way station on Mars. These were all tied into the Tablets of Destiny, computers deep underground beneath the tower, which gave Enlil the ability to oversee and communicate with all areas of his domain. It also gave him control over the satellites, which could be turned into orbiting weapons, hence Zeus' ability to call down lightning bolts from the sky. All the technological and scientific knowledge of the Anunnaki was stored in the Tablets of Destiny. The workers involved in mining and processing in the Abzu were beginning to complain about the harshness of the work, and they were often swapped out with fresh teams from Nibiru. Mining had been going on here for tens of thousands of years at this point, and the Nibiruan atmosphere had long since been repaired, but the mines were kept going for a couple reasons. First, the gold particulate that had been suspended in the troposphere, though effective at retaining the planet's heat and atmosphere and at filtering the radiation from Elenin, had to be occasionally replenished. Also, the Nibiruan scientists had found many uses for gold in their technology. It was mostly used in various alloys, but also in an elixir that was found to greatly support health and which extended their already lengthy lifespans. All was well in Anunnaki society, except for those tasked to work the mines. Even working in shifts that were rotated regularly, nobody really wanted to do it, and the urgency of a home in peril that had once united and propelled them now turned into complacency as the atmosphere of Nibiru was stabilized. The workers on Mars were also complaining about the harsh conditions, so Enlil invited their leader, Anzu, to come to Earth and talk it over. They conferred about the complaints both of them were getting, and they agreed that it would be a good idea to establish a place of rest and relaxation near Sapar spaceport for workers in the area and for those on rotation from Mars and the orbiting stations. After their discussions were concluded, Enlil gave Anzu a tour of the facilities in Nibru-Ki, including the control room, which turned out to be not such a great idea. 4. Upon seeing the Tablets of Destiny and hearing from Enlil of the power and knowledge they possessed, Anzu was filled with a great greed to possess them, so he could become master of both Mars and Earth. After the tour was over and night had fallen, Anzu snuck back to the tower and down to the underground room. He stole the tablets, taking them to Sapar spaceport where he rallied his men and other workers around him. He claimed that there was no reason that they should continue to follow the commands of Enlil, the cruel taskmaster who kept them working in harsh conditions, when now he, Anzu, had control of the great and powerful Tablets of Destiny, and he would lead them to a better life. Enraged at the theft, Enlil commanded his son, Ninurta, to go after Anzu, and gave him an aircraft armed with new, powerful missiles he had been developing. And so Ninurta challenged the rebel Anzu to an aerial battle and defeated him in a dramatic dogfight in the skies over Sapar. Wounded, defeated, and disgraced, Anzu was judged by a council of 7, sentenced to death, and executed. Enki and Damkina's son, Marduk, then replaced him as commander of operations on Mars. Enlil followed through with the idea of an R&R spot at Sapar spaceport, but ultimately that was not enough to quell the growing unrest among the workers, who were still laboring long hours in harsh conditions to bring the gold up from the ground. Soon this discontent in the Abzu would build to full-on rebellion. Enki didn't notice the unrest in his minds or hear much news from the outside world at all really, because he was completely embroiled in another project. He had set up a magnificent laboratory by a waterfall in the Abzu, where he and his son, Ningishzida, were studying and manipulating the life forms of Earth. Enki had become fascinated with the animals of Earth, particularly the primitive, dark-skinned hominids, Homo erectus, that roamed the savanna of Africa at the time. An important note, this entire time, the Anunnaki had been living and interfacing with fifth-density Earth. They were always a 5D race, along with the rest of embodied creation, and so they were aware of the 3D imposed matrix, but they were not subject to it. As a scientist though, Enki had taken to dipping in and out of the third density matrix to study the local life at that level of density. Enki and Ningishzida were experimenting with the DNA of Earth, creating various crossbreeds, some that had the torso of one animal and the legs of another, or some other kind of other mishmash. Ninma, being scientifically minded and curious, also dropped in from time to see their work, and to spend time with Enki, whom she was now paired up with. She used to be lovers with Enlil, which was now yet another sore point between the two princes. The Nakals, who had been monitoring the Anunnaki all along, were disturbed by Enki's genetic tinkering, as they had been carefully shepherding the evolution of life on Earth and weren't sure they wanted it messed with by this more aggressive race, but they decided to let things be for the moment, as they were also curious if perhaps this was destiny working itself out. A note on fate and destiny. These are two distinct things and are often the subject of much debate among the intergalactic community when it comes to allowing or disallowing interventions. Fate is essentially karma, the course that is laid out by the consequences of our own choices, so fate can be changed by changing our actions and our reactions. Destiny is the unstoppable unfolding of universal design, which can be delayed by the actions of fate, but never ultimately changed. When more advanced races ponder whether or not to intervene in a situation, this is often the question about the events under consideration. Is it fate, or is it destiny? The beings who evolve the fastest are the ones who learn to align their fate with their destiny. The growing discontent among the workers led to a decrease in production, and eventually it got bad enough that Enlil dispatched Ninurta to the mines to assess the situation. Once he had met with the workers and heard their complaints about the drudgery of the labor, the long hours, and intense heat in the mines, and felt how much anger and frustration had built up in them, Ninurta became convinced that the matter was getting pretty grim. He traveled back to Nibru-Ki filled with worry that a strike or full-on rebellion was imminent, and he told his father as much when he delivered his report. Convinced of the gravity of the situation, Enlil himself visited the mines, hoping to speak with his people and lift their spirits, but when word got out that the big boss was on site, the miners mutinied and surrounded his compound, demanding to be heard. Enlil assured the workers that he would contact Anu on Nibiru and present their concerns to him and his council, but that he must return to the tower in Nibru-Ki to do so. Hearing this, the workers grudgingly went back to work, and waited. When Enlil met with his father and his council, along with Enki, Ningishzida, and Ninma, Anu insisted that gold production must continue as it was still crucial to Nibiru's survival and to furthering scientific advancement. Enki then surprised them all by disclosing the work he had been doing with the DNA of third-density Earth, and announced that he believed that he could upgrade the DNA of Homo erectus with Anunnaki DNA, resulting in a subservient yet intelligent new 3D worker race that could take the place of the Anunnaki in the mines. Enlil was against the plan. He believed that creating life was in defiance of the father of all. Enki, Ningishzida and Ninma argued that they would not be creating life, merely altering it, as their forefathers had done to create the different forms of Ajiji. After a long and heated discussion, Anu gave Enki, Ninma and Ningishzida his blessing to return to their laboratory by the Great Waterfall and continue their experiments, and he also decided to move to the moon for a while, where the Anunnaki had now established a few cities, so that he could keep a close eye on what unfolded next. Incidentally, when the Anunnaki established those cities on the moon, they actually had to defeat and evict a bunch of Draco who were still hanging out, so their cities were built on the infrastructure of those old reptilian bases. I won't go into the details of this little war, but it was significant because it was the first time that the Anunnaki had come in contact with another intelligent race, much less a race of giant freaking lizards, since the ancient days of their prehistory. It was a bit of a wake-up call to be sure. Enki, Ningishzida and Ninma were hard at work. There were many failures, but eventually success was achieved by fertilizing an Anunnaki ovum with a sperm from Homo erectus in the lab, and then implanting the embryo in Ninma's own womb, where she carried it to term. The resulting male child was named Adamu, Adam, and he was the first of the Homo sapiens. Shortly after this, the first female was successfully produced and given the name Tiamat, Eve. These first of our forebears had only 22 pairs of chromosomes, and were unable to reproduce, which irritated Enki, for he wanted his new species to be able to procreate and flourish, thus swelling the ranks of workers on their own. Enlil approved of their infertility, for he felt the population should be strictly under Anunnaki control, and he didn't like the idea of how similar to his own race the new humans would be, should they be given the chromosomes necessary to be able to reproduce on their own. But Enki didn't see how they could possibly produce enough workers in time to quell the growing unrest in the minds solely through Anunnaki host mothers, without the new species also reproducing itself. So in secret he added 2 branches to our tree of life, the extra pair of chromosomes needed to reproduce, changing our DNA to the way it is now, 2 active strands with 23 pairs. The newly created Homo sapiens still had the potential for 12-strand DNA, as do all descendants of Lyra, but only 2 were active, as is the case with most people today. What scientists call junk DNA is actually the other inactive 10 strands. Once they were grown, Adamu and Tiamat were transported to a protected third-density enclosure in the the Garden of Eden, and then were left to explore their paradise. Their creators watched and also invited the other members of Anunnaki royalty to come and see, as well as the Ajiji and other workers, so they would be mollified that their days of toil were numbered. And indeed, everybody was very pleased and amazed with the results. Everybody except Enlil. When he discovered the forbidden fruit that had been added to our genetic code in secret by his brother, he flew into a rage. He had only grudgingly gone along with the plan in the first place, and now that the new race had been given the knowledge of good and evil, in other words given the ability to have sex and reproduce by the serpent in the garden, one of Enki's symbol is a pair of entwined serpents, symbolizing the double helix DNA strand, he was furious. He didn't like anything momentous being done without his approval, and he viewed the creation of a race that could reproduce to be outside the bounds of what was morally acceptable, and he felt that this new species would eventually come to question their role as a labor force if they were able to have their own children. But now the cat was out of the bag. Once it was established that Adam and Eve could indeed make babies, the first birth was actually twins, a son and daughter. Enlil decreed that they and the other mated pairs that Enki and his team had created be banished from Din and taken to the Abzu. Enlil also decided to hedge his bets by reprogramming some elements of the 3D matrix. The Anunnaki had found the computer systems in the moon that governed its programming, so Enlil altered the programming such that the newly created form of human would be content to be slaves, whose main purpose was to harvest gold for their gods. They also imposed a belief that the human lifespan was limited to 85 years or so, which would prevent people from accumulating enough wisdom in a lifetime to ascend past the imposed 3D frequency. Instead, they would be forced to reincarnate, again and again, each time forgetting much of what they really are. This made it more possible to retain their slave workforce for eons. Over the next 3,600 Earth years, the first Homo sapiens and their offspring proliferated into the worker race the Anunnaki so desperately needed, and along the way there was some more genetic diversity introduced by various members of the Anunnaki going to the third density and having sex with humans, which happened quite a lot actually. As it says in Genesis, the Nephilim, also sometimes translated as giants, were in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God, the Anunnaki, Nephilim, giants, came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. Quote. In fact, Enki was known to be a great seducer of human women. At one point he encountered and mated with 2 women, one who bore a son, Adapa, and the other who bore a daughter, Titi. Adapa and Titi eventually got together and had 2 sons, Cain and Abiel. Cain and Abel, who we know from the Bible, though their story was simplified and condensed such that it was said they were the children of Adam and Eve, which they were, distantly. These various human Anunnaki hybrids were more intelligent and longer lived than the pure Homo sapiens and began to evolve into a more civilized subculture. Adamu was even taken to Nibiru at one point and given the knowledge of farming and shepherding, which he eventually passed on to his sons, Cain the farmer, and Abiel Abel the shepherd. All the stories of the Old Testament spring from this time, and though they have become condensed and distorted with time, there are seeds of truth in all of it. Cain did indeed slay Abiel one day, as they argued over water rights for their crops and sheep. Enki was the serpent in the garden who brought the knowledge of good and evil, and Enlil would become known as that vengeful Old Testament God, Jehovah. In between 300,000–75,000 years ago, human culture on Earth slowly developed and the population of Homo sapiens vastly increased. The population could no longer be contained solely in Mesopotamia and Africa, and mining operations needed to expand as well, for gold in the Abzu was depleted. Mining, and the humans who did it, along with their Anunnaki overseers, spread to parts of North and South America, and to the great archipelagos of the Pacific, which would become known as Mu, and later, Lemuria. There were some unfortunate incidents during this time, as more aggressive groups of Homo sapiens sometimes took to hunting the peaceful, nomadic Neanderthals and other earlier hominid forms that lived in the area that would become Mu. The Nacals, who had watched the evolution of Homo sapiens on the other side of the world as it progressed, did their best to protect their people in Mu, and eventually decided to help bump up the culture and spiritual prowess of some of the early hominids by teaching some select groups about how to tap into their energy bodies for guidance and protection. This was the beginning of the Lemurian mystery school. So despite some ugly exceptions, when the two cultures met and began to mingle, they were relatively equal in terms of intelligence, though they differed greatly in the ways that they had evolved. The Anunnaki-bred humans were more focused on industry and technology, while the inhabitants of what would become Mu were more interested in nature and spiritual development. These are the ancient roots of the basic divide that existed, and still exists, between the civilized cultures of the world, the descendants of the Anunnaki line and eventually Atlantis, and indigenous people, the descendants of the Nacal line and other benevolent genetic farmer races, the children of Mu. The Pleiadian group, who had been here long before any of these new races, were not excited about the hodgepodge mashup of rather primitive cultures now roaming the earth, and they withdrew all their people underground at this point in order to maintain the purity of their lineage, and they have remained underground to this day, uninterested in mixing with the other, more aggressive bloodlines. 200,000 Ya. All the cultures on the surface of the earth faced a new challenge, as the climate began to cool. Civilizations that had been expanding north and south around the world began to retreat back towards the equator. With this retreat, the cultures began to concentrate more, and the seeds of the great, technologically and spiritually advanced cultures that became known as Mu and Atlantis, were planted. One note: the magnetic field and axis of our globe was different at that time, and the land we currently call Antarctica was not covered in ice. It was a fertile land that would eventually become Atlantis. If you go to Google Earth, or any program where you can spin and rotate a globe, you can check out how the poles were aligned then. Go to Antarctica and make it so that it is at the center of your screen. That's Atlantis. Then rotate the globe such that if you spin straight to the left, Africa appears to be laying on its side. If you spin to the right, you encounter a vast swath of ocean that covers the entire face of the globe, with a few islands, such as New Zealand, Fiji, and Hawaii, poking up. This is where Mu was. The Anunnaki in particular were interested in the territory of Atlantis at that time, for Enki had discovered ancient ruins, incredibly ancient, 200 million years old, that nonetheless displayed a highly advanced technology. These ruins were from the ancient builder race, the Paatal, and the Nacals were a branch of that family tree and had known about those ruins for eons, so when Enki discovered the site, the Nacals chose to reveal themselves to him and his people. This eventually widened a gap that had been growing for some time in the Anunnaki culture, for Enki and his followers would come to embrace the teachings of the Nacals, greatly evolve in consciousness, and value a diverse earthly and galactic culture, while Enlil and the people on Nibiru grew less tolerant and more aggressive, and valued the traditions and purity of the Anunnaki race above all else. Other groups of people, in their search for shelter, discovered the vast network of ancient underground caverns and cities, many in ruins, some uninhabited, some populated by Draco, and some by more benevolent groups, which existed under the Earth's crust. This migration of different cultures and races to the underground world would continue over the following hundreds of thousands of years, especially during times of hardship when the surface of the earth was less hospitable, and that subterranean land would become known as Agartha, the inner earth civilization of many cities that spans the globe to this day. 77,000 Ya. Mt. Toba in Indonesia erupted, producing the largest volcanic explosion in human history. Human civilization went through a consolidation at this point which actually greatly increased its potential. The 6-year nuclear winter and 1,000-year ice age that followed reduced the population to only around 2,000 people, but those 2,000 were the smartest, strongest, hardiest and most adaptable. The civilizations that would emerge from this winnowing would be the most advanced that our Earth has ever seen, even to this day. This winnowing almost completely eliminated most of the early hominid groups, such that Homo sapiens emerged as the dominant human group on Earth, though there were still a few pockets of spiritually advanced early hominid groups that did survive, Yetis, Bigfoot, etc. By the time we get to around 75,000 years ago, the Ice Age was beginning to wane, and the civilizations of Earth were mostly concentrated near the equator on the continents of Africa and Atlantis, and on the vast archipelago of Mu. This is 75,000 Ya. This time on Earth was the age of the highest peak of civilization so far experienced on our planet. A time of technologies far more advanced than we see today, advanced spiritual development which was part of the technology. These were higher density technologies based on consciousness, rather than 3D mechanics, and cities made up of many races, both terrestrial and non-living at different levels of density, spread across the globe. Underground, the great inner Earth civilization of Agartha was also well established and still expanding. The beings who lived there were mostly benevolent or neutral, though there was still a pocket of Siakar, the Draco royalty, living in their stronghold under Africa. In the preceding millennia, the Nakals had made themselves known to the Anunnaki and had educated them on the vast interstellar community they were part of. This, combined with the flourishing of mankind and advances in consciousness, opened the gates for many other ET races to visit the Earth, and our world became a true utopia, for a time. Genetic experiments also continued, both through the intermarrying of various races as well as through deliberate manipulation of DNA. By the time Homo sapiens emerged from this period, we would have 22 different races, or genome types, thanks to the influence of 22 different genetic farmer ET races. This furthered the pace of evolution in all areas of life. Enki, in addition to getting all hippie on Enlil by embracing the traditions of the Nakal, also had mated with quite a few different human women at this point, and then elevated some of those children to govern in various locations, which enraged the prudish Enlil, to whom this increasingly complex and intermixed globe seemed more and more tarnished and impure. He longed for the good, old days of Anunnaki dominion, and he began to return to Nibiru more frequently. He also started to mull over possible ways to end the human experiment on Earth. Atlantis, being the center of all things scientific and technological, tended to have an inclination towards a manifest destiny kind of attitude. They were more concerned with what could be achieved and discovered, than they were with maintaining harmony with nature and spiritual equanimity, more concerned with what they could do, and not so much with what they should do. They did work to develop their consciousness as well, but also with interfacing those advancements with more mechanical creations. The civilizations in Atlantis were centered around cities, and the capital city, which was actually on an island just off the northern tip of the continent, was built in 3 concentric rings, which was also the symbol of Atlantis in general. In the center ring dwelt the Nakals, the ascended masters, whom Enki, recognizing that they were far more advanced in consciousness than his people, had entreated to take up residence. They served as the guiding spiritual and moral hand for the Atlantean culture, and their 5D city, Shambhala, served as the spiritual center for the earth. In the next ring lived the Maya. These were essentially the priesthood, the folks who served as an interface between the common people and the Nakals, and who supported the people in the advancement of their consciousness. Some also pursued their own ends, developing different sciences and technologies. The Maya were, at first, exclusively comprised of a race of human ETs who had traveled here to be part of this time on Earth, but over time they accepted members of other races into the Atlantean mystery school they formed, and also into their ranks as honorary members. In the outer ring lived everybody else, many people from many different races, both terrestrial and non, and they came in all shapes, colors and sizes. In MU they also were interested in technological development, but were more interested in achieving advancements in consciousness, realizing that with sufficiently advanced development of their energy body, the need for mechanical technology pretty much disappeared, though they did manipulate the natural world to great effect, such as weather modification to maximize crops, and islands and mountains that were essentially manifested from the raw materials of Earth to protect the population against typhoons. Take the inexplicable city of Nan Madol, constructed entirely of magnetic columnar basalt logs laid on top of one another, 5 to 25 tons each. Of course, modern scientists are baffled because they don't know that these giant rocks were moved using sound and consciousness, which is how most of the unexplained megalithic structures of Earth were built. The combined magnetism of that much basalt in one place could be harnessed to literally zap threatening typhoons. The Lemurians also had a consciousness-based technology that enabled them to share memories, to literally step into a vivid memory complete with all the 5 senses. This technology has been preserved by the Aboriginal culture in Australia, who were originally Lemurians, who call it the Dreamtime. The culture of MU planted the seeds of some of our current spiritual traditions. Some of the ideas behind Buddhism and Hinduism can be traced back to there. The cultural organization was also more loose in Lemuria, resembling nomadic and rural culture more than the Atlantean urban lifestyle. This was a time of harmony and mostly peaceful interactions between these cultures. Many Atlanteans would travel to MU to get back to the land, and to develop their consciousness and spiritual practices, and the more scientific-minded Lemurians would travel to Atlantis to pursue greater learning in those fields. All in all, it was a pretty great time to be alive on Earth, and a lot of us here now, when we long for utopia or a more advanced civilization or responding to the cellular memory of this time. The majority of the population was still living in the 3D matrix, but many had broken their programming of limiting beliefs and had ascended into the 5D frequency. And the 3D civilization had a very high level of technology that incorporated both etheric and physical devices. The creation myths of the South American, Pacific, and South Pacific island cultures all come from this time, from those people's memory of the land of Mu, and many of the stories in the mythology of ancient Egypt actually came not from Egypt, but from Atlantis. For example, the tale of Osiris and Set. Some of the members of the Maya circle developed their consciousness enough that they achieved immortality through the ascension process and became honorary members of the Nacals. The first one to do this was an accomplished student of mixed birth named Osiris, and he achieved it kinda by accident with a little help from his brother, Set. Osiris and Set were both mixed-race children. Their father was Marduk, also known as Ra, the Anunnaki commander who had run operations on Mars for many years but who had returned to Earth a while back and had quite a few affairs with local women. Osiris was already a very talented and accomplished student at the Atlantean Mystery School, and his brother was jealous and bitter. Perhaps through the random chance of genetic variation, or maybe because his soul had carried the coding in with it because of karma, Set had inherited some of the worst tendencies of the reptilian side of his father's Anunnaki DNA. Remember, the Anunnaki themselves were reptilian-human hybrids. He was violent, powerful, and service to self-minded, with an attitude that was set on domination. Although he excelled at destruction, he could not achieve the kind of advanced feats of consciousness, more powerful than any weapon, that seemed to come effortlessly to his brother, Osiris, which drove him nuts. So yeah, when he heard the news that Osiris had been called forth as a candidate for ascension into the ranks of the Nacals, he pretty much lost his shit and ambushed Osiris, killing and dismembering him while he was deep in meditation, and then burying the pieces in various locations across Atlantis. Osiris had been deep in meditation, practicing and preparing himself for the ascension attempt, so he was not able to react in time to stop the killing blow, But upon sensing his brother's imminent attack, Osiris was able to pull his consciousness out of his physical body and into the Merkaba, light body, he had just been working on. He then simply followed Set while he disposed of the body and then guided his wife and sister to those places shortly after, who recovered his missing parts. Osiris could have remained a light being, or reincarnated, or manifested a plasma body, but he had a fondness for his flesh and blood form and didn't wish to relinquish it just yet. Using consciousness, he was able to fuse his parts back together and then re-inhabit his physical form, only now with a fully functioning light body which enabled him to transform his physical self into light and back at will. This was the process of resurrection, and as far as I know he was the first one to do it. The Nacals already had perfected the path to ascension, which had the same outcome ultimately, but Osiris was the first to actually repair, re-inhabit, and then ascend a physical form that had been deceased. Something that a guy named Yeshua ben Joseph, aka Jesus, would learn how to do many thousands of years later at a mystery school in Tibet. All was going swimmingly on Earth until about 52,000 Ya, when something happened that began the long slide into darkness from which we are only just now emerging. 52,000 Ya. The whole continent of Atlantis was buzzing with the news. The Nacals and Maya were going to manifest a tree of life on Atlantis, an energetic matrix comprised of 10 energy vortexes. This would accelerate all development on Atlantis, especially the development of consciousness. They laid out their grid that spanned the continent with the following shape. Note: a full tree of life has an additional sphere at the top and bottom for a total of 12 energy centers, but I couldn't find an image that had all 12 spheres, and the names and qualities, so this picture only has 10 spheres. Notice how each one to the vortexes has a certain archetypal quality, or vibration. There were groups of people on Earth at the time who matched the vibration of each of these centers, and they had been gathered together at the vortexes to reinforce and embody that frequency, thus grounding it into the 3D plane, with the exception of 2 spots. None had been found that matched the vibration of 2, chakma, roughly translated as wisdom, but more specifically this refers to spiritual law and purpose, and 8, had, splendor, meaning more specifically majesty and intellect. The architects of this grid decided to go ahead anyway, determining that these 2 empty vortexes would draw the life that matched their vibration to it, possibly from some of the people who lived under the Earth's crust in Agartha. Or perhaps from nearby star systems. And yeah, that's what happened, but with some unfortunate results. 2 groups from the stars were indeed drawn to these energetic power spots. The first was the group we know today as the Hebrews, and they were just fine. They were a nomadic civilization descended from the ancient Paatal race and still remembered and revered the ancient creator of the human DNA strand, their God, YHWH, Yahweh, who was actually still around in our universe, mostly hanging out in the 6th density, and who would guide and intervene for his people when they needed him. The Hebrews were seekers of wisdom and had intricate systems of spiritual law, and they matched the vibration of Chakma. They were largely left-brain dominant, and the Earth would provide a valuable education for them in right-brain experiences. They were welcomed by the Nacals and the priesthood and settled into their territory. The other group was not so good. Remember the Dark Men from Orion. The 13 royal bloodlines who had fled into spacetime about 2.4 million years ago, as the planet they had subjugated, Maldek, blew into bits. This was the opportunity they had seen back then. Using synthetic Merkaba technology that gave them access to frequencies of existence where time is not linear, they traveled to this time and place. Even though they were service to self-minded, their vibration matched the archetype of majesty, royalty, and intellect that was vibrating in the Had vortex. For them the journey was almost instantaneous. One moment they were in their ships on Maldek as it blew to bits, the next they were manifesting in this vortex on Atlantis, 52,000 years ago. But it was to great surprise and consternation of the Orion group when they emerged into an imposed 3D matrix, the dissonance of which fried their ships and hurt their consciousness. They essentially crash-landed and have been stuck here since. Needless to say, the Nacals were concerned by their service to self-vibration and the reverberations of violence and vengeance in their karmic field, but basically had the attitude of, well, if this is what has manifested, then it must be what is needed. So the 13 royal bloodlines, those that would become what we call today the Illuminati, or Cabal, were once again reluctantly invited into Utopia. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy, and on our planet that are relevant to our current. The fall of these great civilizations culminated in the event referred to in the Bible, and in many other religious texts and indigenous histories, as the Great Flood, or the Great Cataclysm, but there was a very long, slow decline over the 40,000 years that preceded this dramatic desolation. 40,000 years is still a really long time. A lot of that time was still basically good, and of course there were many ups and downs, but the general trend in Atlantis was one of a decline in the exploration of consciousness and an increase in science, technology and military development. This was mostly due to the influence of the 13 royal bloodlines, who we will refer to as the Cabal from here on out. The Nacals and Maya were too strong for the Cabal to simply take over, so instead they inserted themselves into the society and quietly, persistently worked to further their agenda through creating more and more left-brained technical marvels, which were seductive to the common folk and which influenced a general trend towards valuing technology and craftsmanship over the development of consciousness. As they have done since time immemorial on this planet, they slowly infiltrated the ranks of power until there were members of the Cabal within all the power structures except the inner circle of Nacals, playing the game but steadily working towards their own agenda of control and military might. They also met with the Draco who were mostly under the earth at this time in Agartha, and discovered that their agendas and polarities were aligned. This began the beginning of a long alliance that exists to this day. Many people think that the Draco are the Cabal, but they are only part of it. Atlantis steadily became more and more militaristic and interested in overseeing the development of the whole globe, and Mu began to isolate itself to protect the more spiritual inhabitants of that land from the corrupting influence of the Cabal's agenda. Over time the two lands became polarized and divided. Skirmishes, and eventually full-out wars, began to break out between them. Seeing where all this was headed, and because of the lower vibratory rate that was painful to them, the Nacals began to distance themselves more and more from the third-density Earth and returned to Shambhala, which was still floating above the Earth, and to other fifth-density bases on Venus. Various higher consciousness groups from Mu and Atlantis also fled into the Earth and the expanding 4D Agarthan civilization, in order to escape the increasing conflict on the surface. 13,000 Ya. Enlil has been on Nibiru for some time now and only occasionally visited the Earth, where Enki was still in residence. One night, his astronomers informed him that they had discovered that the next time Nibiru passed close to the Sun, the trajectories of it and the Earth's orbits would bring the two planets perilously close together, which would undoubtedly trigger massive natural disasters on the Earth's surface. Nibiru would be affected as well, but it was not a very watery planet, not really a planet at all remember, but a long smoldering star, so it would not be subject to the same kind of tectonic effects and resulting water displacement. This was music to Enlil's ears. Not only was the world descending more and more into turmoil, but with 21 other races stirring up the gene pool, and with the intermixing of Anunnaki blood with the blood of Homo sapiens and other species, he felt that the Earth experiment had failed. He welcomed this opportunity to cleanse the Earth and start over again, and so he forbade his scientists from informing anyone else about the impending calamity. Enki though, he was a scientist as well, and he regularly observed the stars, the planets, and their orbits from Earth, and so he came to the same realizations as Enlil's scientists had, but when he communicated his discovery to Enlil he was dismayed, for his half-brother then placed upon him the same restriction as he had placed upon his science division. But Enki, now very different from his half-brother due to all the time he had put into developing his consciousness, loved his people and the civilizations of Earth too much to stay silent. He informed the Maya of the impending calamity and they quietly began to collect DNA from the plants and animals of Earth and to place these genetic seeds in an ark, which was actually a spacecraft not a boat. However, submersible vessels were also constructed for the people to take refuge in when the time came. The head engineer of this whole project was named Noah. The Nakals, who already knew all about this impending side-swipe by Nibiru, and a few high-ranking Maya also took it upon themselves to start preparing the Earth energetically, for the Nakals foresaw a looming collapse not just in civilization, but in consciousness as well. They began constructing sacred temples all over the Earth, mainly pyramids, which they would later use to build and maintain a new consciousness grid, should the existing one totally collapse. This is the time during which the Great Pyramids of Giza were built, before the flood, which is why sea salt and marine fossils have been found on and in the Egyptian pyramids. There's a reason why all the modern theories about how the pyramids were built are problematic, and it's because they are all wrong. The pyramids were actually manifested, whole and complete in the 6th density by the Nakals, then they simply lowered the structure's vibratory rate down to the 3rd density where they became stone. This is how they were so precisely aligned as well, not a problem when you do it all at once. This was all kept quiet from the general populace, but the Cabal, thanks to their far-reaching influence and high placement in administrative and religious offices, knew about it before too long, and they decided to take their own approach to the problem. They had, long ago, harnessed 5th density energy and constructed an artificial Merkaba weapon on Maledeck that had the power to blast a planet out of the sky, and which had ended up blasting their own planet out of the sky. One would think that they might have learned from their previous disaster, but the Cabal are nothing if not arrogant. Some records of the device still remained, and the Cabal scientists were confident that with those documents and their own innovation they could construct such a weapon again, especially given the Tree of Life energy vortex that was integrated into the continent, which gave them an easy source of energy to work with. So on Atlantis, as Enki and the Maya worked to preserve life and civilization after the inevitable catastrophe, the Cabal worked to avoid it entirely by building a terrible weapon capable of destroying Nibiru before it got too close. On Mu the people were prepared in a different way. Forewarned by the Nakals and by others with consciousness that had developed enough for them to see through time, the people of Mu began to move their settlements from the coastal areas they had always inhabited up into the mountainous regions of Mu, and also into the underground civilization of Agartha. 12,500 Ya. The best way to sum up the cataclysm would be to say that just about everything that could go wrong, did go wrong. There had been intermittent war between Atlantis and Mu for almost 1,000 years at this point, and both lands had suffered damage. The Nakals sensed what the Cabal was up to and had urged the Maya caste to take action, but the Maya were up to their necks already trying to preserve the life on Earth in the face of the impending calamity, collecting and preserving DNA strains and overseeing the construction of vessels, as well as making contact and negotiation with various inner Earth groups. They sent some priests to check out the activity in the Cabal's sector, but if the Cabal were ever good at anything, it was keeping a secret. So the Nakals turned to the warrior caste of the Lemurian people and implored them to launch some special ops missions into the Cabal's labs, to try and sabotage the development of the weapon, which they did. Just a note here, though they had made exceptions in the past, the Nakals were generally hesitant to take sides or influence events in any way, so what gives with this outright encouragement of an act of war? They were desperate, that's why. They could see down the probable timelines and they almost all pointed to something very bad. Bad not just for the Earth, but for the whole of creation because of the importance of the Earth. Remember, she holds a major piece of divine feminine energy. The raids were partially successful, in that they did manage to slow down the Cabal's plans, but they were massively unsuccessful in another way. The Cabal used the attack on their labs to stir up outrage among some of the more militarily minded factions of Atlantis, whom they had been allies with for thousands of years already, and basically used the incident as pretext for stirring up war between the two continents. So amid secret preparations for sustaining life, mass migrations of people in Mu, development of a secret weapon by the Cabal, and a giant planet heading into almost sideswipe the Earth, now there was warfare in the mix as well. Even some nukes were used by Atlantis, which began to destabilize the entire geographic region of Mu. As the Nibiru got closer, and the effects began to be noticed on the tides, the Cabal turned on their planet killer. Now here's the thing about this kind of technology, it's very unstable and dangerous. It takes precise calculations and instrumentation, the most refined construction and attention to detail. The Cabal scientists were very good, but it had been, in their time, about 50,000 years since they had last built something like this, and they had never attempted to construct such a device in the third density. They were working from fragments of old plans, and in their pride and vanity not only did they not think about their limitations of understanding and that there might be crucial holes in their plans, they also didn't realize that because the energy grid they were tapping to power their machine had been created solely with consciousness and love, it would not be a good vibratory match for their creation, which was intended to destroy. It had worked okay in the lower energy testing phases, but when they turned the thing on and cranked it up in preparation to fire, things went sideways very, very quickly. First there was a massive earthquake, which destroyed much of Atlantis and began its slide into the sea. It even reached as far as Mu and destabilized that continental plate even more. Nibiru's massive magnetic field then began to push on Earth's magnetic field, beginning a shift in the magnetic poles. Upon seeing this, obsessed with their objective, and secure in their own personal safety, the Cabal fired upon Nibiru. Oops. The resulting devastation didn't harm Nibiru at all. The energy of the weapon didn't even make it past Earth's upper atmosphere, but it totally wreaked havoc on Earth. Most of the rest of the Atlantean cities were immediately destroyed as a result of the physical explosion and the continent sank beneath the sea. And, because of the nature of the technology involved, the explosion was metaphysical as well. A rift was torn open in creation and the creatures of the void, the Asuras, were let into our plane of existence, where they immediately attached themselves to the energy fields of whomever was around. The Nacals, who were having a busy day to say the least, managed to send much of that parasitic energy back to its plane and close the rift, but the damage had been done. The demons had attached to members of the Cabal and to the common citizens of the sinking Atlantis, and it was now part of their energy field and could not be easily or quickly pulled out without destroying, or severely damaging the host. Think about trying to pull out a tick. A chunk of your flesh will come with it if you don't do it in the most careful, gentle way and with the right technique. It's the same with the Asuras. They can be removed, but it's a delicate procedure, and the Nacals had their hands full with so much else. The way that the Cabal experienced that energy attaching was as a rush of increased power, for they were already aligned with that vibration. The common folk, though, they experienced that energy as an increase in survival terror and as pervasive negative thought loops that mostly vibrated hostility and a sense of, I shouldn't exist here, and so neither should anything else. Many were driven mad with terror, or turned violent. Many people were affected by these demonic energies, and the imprints and negative thought, emotion loops that they established in the etheric field and psyche are still all around us today. But all of that was just the beginning of the cataclysm. Then the poles shifted. The magnetic intensity of Nibiru's proximity not only nudged the Earth's magnetic field out of whack, it also heated up the interior of the Earth, and the mantle liquefied to the point that the Earth's crust became slippery. So when the poles suddenly and dramatically shifted, so did the continental plates, causing the Great Flood. Giant tsunamis thousands of feet tall rippled around the globe. And not only that, there was such severe and bizarre weather phenomenon that some places, including Atlantis, were flash frozen even as they were submerged. The islands of Mu were completely wiped out and much of the continental plate that held them up sank into the ocean. When it was all over, the globe looked basically as it does today, the Earth we are familiar with. Many people did survive, the Lemurians who had migrated high into the mountains or deep under the earth, and the Atlanteans who had made it into the submersibles after the first earthquake, and the Ark survived as well. It carried the DNA of most of the plant and animal life of Earth, and it also carried the highest-ranking members of the Maya, and some of those whom had ascended to honorary Nacal status, who would play a huge role in helping clean up the mess and re-establish civilization later on. We had lived, during the Golden Age, as a great multi-density civilization, focused on creating beauty and developing our sciences and consciousness. Now, after the cataclysm, most people left on the surface were living in survival mode. Driven by desperate circumstances and invasive Asuric energies, we regressed to a more primitive tribal existence. There were some exceptions. Those who had made it into Agartha would continue to thrive and develop underground. Some settled in existing cities, and others were given permission to build their own. Many of the tribes of Mu who had fled to the mountains preserved their ancient wisdom and lived in peaceful cultures in the islands of the South Pacific and in areas of South America, though some of these folks also fell prey to the Asuric energy, which started to encourage dark religious practices involving human sacrifice. And then there were the Nacals in Shambhala, and the Maya group in their ark, floating above the earth. But there was also the Cabal, most of whom had survived, and even had their dark energy increased by the Asuras. They rode out the cataclysm in their enormous ships which were now buried deep under the ice in Antarctica, and the general vibe of fear and survival which permeated the Earth after this great plunge in civilization and consciousness was an opening for them to step fully into power, which is where they have been ever since. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our multiverse, galaxy, and on our planet that are relevant to our current situation. To go to the main 10,000 BC, OAD. From this point on we already have one history that's been accepted, the one we all learn, about cavemen and primitive tribes, the early civilizations of Egypt, Greece, the Orient, etc. What is missing is the massive backdrop of all that went before and the fact that there were other, higher density realities and beings with agendas both positive and negative in the picture, and behind the scenes. The Nacals and various high-ranking members of the Maya priesthood, along with the positive polarity Anunnaki and other genetic farmer races, did their best to shepherd and guide the people back towards a more evolved consciousness, sometimes overtly and sometimes by discreetly nudging events and people here and there. The first thing they had to do was reseed plant and animal life from the DNA they had gathered before the cataclysm and continue to develop the consciousness grid they had anchored with the network of pyramids across the globe. As the years passed they would guide their followers across the world and help them construct more pyramids and massive megalithic structures to strengthen the consciousness grid. Think of Stonehenge and all the other standing stone sites across the world, as well as the pyramids that have been found on all continents, some very recently. Many of these were constructed during this span of time. Also, a note on their construction, these later structures actually were built with stone, not manifested down from the higher density like the Great Pyramids of Giza, but they were not built by hand, but rather through the use of anti-gravity technology. Some of this tech was in the form of actual devices handed down through the generations from Atlantean times, but more often the higher-ranking priests in the culture, who had been initiated in various teachings through their gods, used consciousness and sound to move and place the stones. Also the reason that most of the pyramids that were built during this time have flat tops, and this is true all across the world, South America, China, the South Pacific, is because the apex of the pyramid was actually a fourth-density mini-pyramid that sat on top of the flat stone. It was a higher-density pyramid that was powered by the stone structure and interfaced with the consciousness grid. Most of the Nacals settled in India and Tibet, where many of the higher consciousness folks from Lemuria had ended up. If you examine the ancient Vedic scripts and artwork you will see numerous references and depictions of advanced flying craft and weaponry as well as undeniably alien figures. Krishna was blue, remember. These were the vessels and personages of the Nacal group and other ET races. Most of the Maya ended up as, well, the Mayans. They settled in South America and began intermixing with the local folks who were mostly made up from survivors of the general populace of Mu. By the time 2500 BC rolled around they had a well-established civilization, the only civilization in South America to have a comprehensive writing system and precise, advanced architecture featuring, surprise, many pyramids. The reason the Mayan culture vanished mysteriously around 1000 AD is because they were needed back on their home planet. They have recently returned to help us out, but I'll get to that later. Another branch from the Atlantean Mystery School came to Britain and established the Order of Druids there, as well as the fourth density community that would be called Avalon. Also remember that there were 22 genetic farmer races at this time, and most of them took those in their respective genetic programs under their wing, sometimes literally. There's a reason that the ancient Chinese and Japanese cultures feature dragons as benevolent gods, for the farmer races of those lineages were from various branches of the dragon queen Tiamat's people, who were a benevolent reptilian race, though Japanese history also features evil dragons, and these were from a different race of sea-dwelling reptilians who were not so nice. The earthly Nordic races were helped out by their progenitors, the Nordic ET group, and the Asgardian people, who have been prominently featured lately in the Marvel films. Incidentally, the Marvel films are all part of the partial disclosure agenda. I'll get into the difference between this and full disclosure later, and have a lot of factual elements that are presented as fantasy. Asgard, the ice giants, enormous floating battle carriers with cloaking technology, an intergalactic multi-density civilization with many types of beings, both good and evil, an evil group secretly working within the Earth's intelligence community to bring about world domination, Hydra equals Cabal, etc. All based on fact. The Hebrew people have a story of 10 lost tribes that vanished in the time after the flood. This is because they were split up during the devastation of Atlantis. The lost tribes were a contingent of the Hebrew people who had been in MU for quite some time, developing their consciousness and living a life more immersed in nature. When the cataclysm struck, those who were on Atlantis ended up going east and establishing what would become Israel, and the ones on MU were driven west and north to what would become America and Canada. The Aboriginal tribes of North America, and some groups in the Caribbean, are actually the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. There are many tribes of Native Americans, but in general, consider these similarities between that race and the Hebrews. Similar facial features and similar coloring in skin, hair, and eyes. Both groups call the Creator Yahweh or some variation of that, like Yah, Yohewa. Both groups tended toward a nomadic lifestyle. Both groups carried some sort of ark into battle. Both groups celebrate 7 feasts, keep a 7th day of rest, had cities of refuge, and don't eat pork. Even the wording of many of the prayers from both cultures are the same or similar. The positive polarity Anunnaki who were still on Earth at this point helped out the people who flocked back to Mesopotamia and cultivated the development of what would become the Egyptian culture. This is pretty easily observed in our consensual version of history, for modern historians have been baffled by the so-called stair-step evolution of Egyptian culture. First there was only an oral tradition, then suddenly, bam. There is a complete system of writing all at once used by everyone, then bam. Water and moat systems are implemented, then bam. Advanced hydraulic systems are suddenly put into place across the land. Each one of these developments are referred to in Egyptian lore as gifts from the gods, which they were, though one must substitute et for God in order to be accurate. During this time of cultural development there was still division in the ranks among the Anunnaki. Like Enki, many had cultivated their consciousness and embraced a service to others vibration, and others had most definitely not, and still embraced the vibration of service to self. Most of the negative polarity Anunnaki were back on Nibiru, but there were a few powerful exceptions, and this created debate and conflict, mostly about the best way to cultivate human civilization, mainly revolving around what degree of interference should be allowed, and if it was still okay to use humans as a labor force to advance their own agenda of gold mining, etc. The two people who would butt heads the most about this were Marduk, now called Ra, and Ningishzida, now called Thoth. Eventually Enki, who kept behind the scenes during this time and was unknown to the Egyptians, stepped in and settled the dispute and reluctantly gave the territory to his son Marduk, Ra, hoping that the hard lessons of leadership might change his mindset and help him develop compassion and empathy. But Ra rewrote the histories to make himself the supreme god, though Thoth continued to be venerated by the people. Thoth then went on to help out with Stonehenge around 2800 BC. After that traveled to the developing Mayan civilization, where he became known as Quetzalcoatl. From this point on, when intervening in some way, all the genetic farmer races would pose as gods to their respective groups, as it was much easier for the consciousness of the people at that time to accept that there were gods, than it was for them to accept there were many advanced races of extraterrestrials. This is why the Egyptian gods were often half-animal in features. These were merely presentations by the Anunnaki, and by some of the Draco as well, to make themselves appear more mysterious and, well, godly. Another group that involved itself heavily in the Egyptian culture were the 13 royal bloodlines from Orion. This race had massive, elongated skulls, which you can see in many of the depictions of pharaohs from ancient Egyptian dynasties. Later on, the Anunnaki would cultivate another emerging civilization in the same area, the Greeks. With the Greeks they abandoned the disguises they had used with the Egyptians, at least mostly. They did lighten their skin a bit to appear more similar to the Greeks, for consciousness in the Greeks at that time, around 700 BC, was more highly advanced and they could accept that the gods could appear like them and still be divine. Some members of the Anunnaki once again indulged in having sex with mortal women, which is recounted in Greek history. By the time Greek culture was well established, the consciousness grid across the earth, which had been built by the Nacals and cultivated by other farmer races and their people, began to reach its full potential. It was basically like a crutch to bolster human consciousness, so that it could grow again, and as the grid got stronger, so did human consciousness. Greek culture represented a real upsurge in consciousness, for while they did still act on desires for conquest, think of Alexander the Great, they also investigated and greatly furthered the sciences, philosophy, ethics, and mastered many art forms. This upsurge in consciousness in turn bolstered the grid, and the consciousness field of the Earth began to be more organic and less reliant on the built grid. And this was a threat to the Cabal, as was the conquest of Egypt by the Greeks, a move which the Greek gods had encouraged because of the depth to which the Orion group had infiltrated that society. If you look at images from the Toltemic dynasty, you'll notice no more elongated skulls. The elite of the Orion group had been mostly hanging out in Antarctica, quietly continuing their pursuits of advancement in the sciences, particularly in genetic manipulation and electromagnetic gravitic weaponry, scalar weapons. But they had long ago also interbred with humans and established tendrils of their bloodlines throughout many cultures, most prominently in Egyptian culture as previously mentioned, and they were also connected to their Draco allies under the ground and throughout the world. They kept their finger on the pulse of what was happening and, as Greek understanding continued to push the consciousness grid towards a positive, fourth density state, they decided to take action. They had already infiltrated another culture that was emerging in the area, Rome. This is why the Romans were the most powerful, brutal, bloody, war-minded culture to emerge from this time period, for the Cabal infiltrated all levels of that society and did what they do best. Nudge it towards service to self and conquest of others. There were many good elements in Roman culture as well. There are good people everywhere after all, but the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and the devastation it wreaked along the way, can be traced back to the infiltration by the Cabal and its appetites. The Romans won a decisive victory over the Greeks in the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC, and then later went on to conquer the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt in 30 BC, and as part of this decimation of Greek culture the Romans adopted the Greek pantheon of gods, but they changed the names. Zeus became Jupiter, Poseidon became Neptune, etc., and they really inherited these gods in name only, for the positive Anunnaki, heartbroken by the decimation of the culture they had been cultivating and which had shown such promise, basically said, fuck it. At this point, and most of them returned to Nibiru. While conquering Egypt, the Roman leaders also came into contact with the ancient dark religious practices that the Orion group had established there, which had continued underground during the Ptolemaic dynasty, practices involving the torture and sacrifice of humans, including children. Many Roman leaders were initiated into these groups, and this laid the foundation for the satanic religion that we see practiced all over the earth by the Cabal and its associates to this day. In fact, one of the biggest centers of satanic worship has been, ironically, the Vatican and Roman Catholic Church. The consciousness grid had its work cut out for it against the influence of the Cabal. Despite great teachers who came down from the sixth density to help, like good, O.L. Siddhartha Gautama, Buddha, and Yeshua ben Joseph, Jesus, the Cabal was generally successful at eventually perverting the teachings of these great figures and twisting them into religions that served the Cabal's ends. Although this was less so with Buddhism, for when Siddhartha was teaching, the Cabal was still mostly staying behind the scenes. By the time of Christ's crucifixion at the hands of the Cabal, the earth was a very dark place. From the height of the Roman Empire to the present day, the Cabal has had uncontested control of the power structures on this planet, although mostly from behind the scenes. So I think it would be good to stop for a moment and ask the question, why? Why does the Cabal have a need to dominate, oppress, and enslave the people of Earth? What is their motivation? The obvious answer is so that they can continue to ensure their own power and comfort, but there is a deeper motivation underneath that, and that is loosh. Loosh is the psychic, emotional chemical energy that is emitted by beings who are suffering and tormented. It gives those who tap into it an intense, erotic high that is extremely addictive. This is why all the members of the Cabal, both human and non, have such a penchant for pedophilia and the torture of children, for the psychic, emotional chemical emanations of innocent children is especially strong. To this day, thousands of children are kidnapped every year and used for these dark rituals. Along with loosh, there is the neurochemical analog, adrenochrome, which is produced by the human endocrine system when a person is in the most extreme agony and close to death. I won't go into the details of how they harvest this from the children, as it is too gruesome for most to comprehend. Suffice to say, it involves torture worse than you would want to imagine. The adrenochrome is taken as a drug by the elite and by those they wish to enslave and control. It gives one perpetual youth, as long as one continues taking it, and also an incredible high along with superhuman mental perception. One of the biggest arguments I hear from people who do not believe in the Cabal is, how could a handful of elites possibly control and manipulate all those news anchors, Hollywood celebrities, politicians, and so on? The answer is blackmail and adrenochrome. Once you take it, you are basically doomed, for if you stop taking it, the withdrawal is so intense it can lead to psychosis or death, and the benefits from taking it are so powerful that most wouldn't want to stop anyway. So the elites seduce influential people, or people with the potential to be influential, step by step into this web, first with power and money, then with forbidden pleasures like sex with children, which is always secretly filmed to be used for blackmail, and eventually with adrenochrome. But there are more commonplace examples of loosh that we see every day: the terror of war, the desire to slow down and look at a car wreck, the addictive pleasures of pornography, the thrill of a horror flick, even the constant nagging worry over unpaid bills and deadlines. These are all ways in which the common populace gets seduced by, and perpetuates, the dark energy of loosh every day. The Cabal is now made up of humans like you and me, and by different kinds of Draco, but it was started by the extraterrestrial group from Orion, and many of those beings are still present in the third, fourth and fifth densities and are connected psychically to higher-ranking members of the Cabal. Higher density consciousness reptilians, like the Siakar, or White Draco, are also overlords of this group, and for these higher density creatures, loosh is an extremely potent food and drug all in one, like the dark version of mana, or divine nectar. This is one of the basic, fundamental driving forces behind all the control and oppression we have experienced, the need to keep people suffering so that they keep perpetuating misery and keep producing loosh for the members of the Cabal overlords to slurp up. And one more thing. In addition to the addictive pleasures of the loosh itself, all the members of the Cabal are also fundamentally driven by the energy of Orion, which perpetuates all service to self-consciousness. At the core level, it is Orion's urge to destroy all of creation that fuels this nastiness. From the period that followed the destruction of Atlantis and Mu up to the early Dark Ages, there was occasional open conflict going on between various groups of genetic farmer races, which often took place in the skies above Earth. Many of these battles are recounted and depicted in the stories and artwork of the ancient Vedic texts, which referred to the flying craft as Vimanas. Eventually it was decided that these overt displays of technology were interfering with the sociological development of the population, and so, shortly after the time of Muhammad, a treatise was signed and given the name, the Muhammad Accords. This agreement stated that manipulation of the human race and conflict between ET groups could hereafter only take place behind the scenes. The unfortunate outcome of this was that the Cabal only grew stronger, for behind-the-scenes manipulation was, and is, their specialty. The Dark Ages, the period of time after the fall of the Roman Empire and up to the Renaissance, was a time during which the Cabal spread and infiltrated many societies and institutions across the globe. Not much was going on other than suffering and power struggles, which only strengthened the Cabal's grip on the land. There were some beacons of light still, which were kept glowing by small groups operating mostly in secret, the true followers of Buddha, Christ, and Muhammad, as well as a few secret societies who passed down the enlightened teachings and history of the Golden Age of Atlantis and MU from generation to generation. In general, though, the overall trend of this time, even through the Renaissance and continuing to this present day, has been one of domination, colonialism and manifest destiny, increased disconnection from the earth and nature, and an increased trend towards industrial might and warfare, all orchestrated by the cabal which was, and is still, infiltrated throughout all levels of all cultures, although not for much longer, which we'll get to later. There were better times when reason and love burned more brightly, like the Persian Empire, which was ended by the Arab conquest of Persia. This in turn brought about the Golden Age of Islam, which was ended by the Mongol horde, or the Renaissance, which was subsumed by climate shifts, the Black Plague, and warfare, all of which the cabal had a hand in perpetuating. Basically, the Dark Ages never ended. The debt-based economy rules. The oppression of indentured servitude, slavery, and the rule of kings has simply been replaced by the 9-to-5 work week and pretend governments that function only as a smoke screen. The yoke and plow have been replaced by the remote control and smartphone. We have progressed our level of technology and ability to create creature comforts greatly, yet our basic enslavement and oppression are the same. We are just more comfy and therefore more complacent. Make no mistake, we have, for well over 2,000 years, been living on a slave planet. The cabal's systems of control extend throughout all of society, particularly in the way that mainstream media and entertainment program our consciousness. The greatest tool the cabal has to oppress us is also the thing that can set us free, for they know that reality fundamentally emanates from consciousness and that by programming it the way that they want they can perpetuate the reality they want. In order to break out of this, we have to learn to harness the power of our consciousness and focus it on the reality we want. This is tricky though because of all the trauma we have experienced, both collectively and as individuals. Unresolved trauma keeps us in survival mode and makes it very difficult to even access the parts of the brain and nervous system that facilitate powerful, intentional consciousness. I'll get into the solution to all that towards the end of this publication. It all started with a group called the Virile Society. There were many secret societies at this time, in many parts of the world, both positive and negative, who were experimenting with consciousness and had been passing down those traditions since the time of Atlantis and MU, but we are going to focus on the Virile, for it was they who first left the surface of the Earth and began exploring our solar system, and then our galaxy. Maria Orsic. Maria was born in 1895 in Zagreb, Croatia and exhibited psychic talents early on. Her interest in the occult eventually led her to a secret society, the Thule Gesellschaft, in Munich, where she trained and cultivated her abilities. Not long after joining the Thule, she created her own group from among her female friends. In fact, the Virile Society seems to have been comprised entirely of stunning women with psychic abilities. Maria Orsic. Members of the Virile Society. In the process of their meditations and cultivation of consciousness, they met psychically with two different groups, one close to home and one not so much. The first group they encountered in their astral travels was a local reptilian group, the Draco, who dwelt in Agartha underneath the surface of the earth, who were much enamored of the beautiful human females, and who, no doubt, had a dark agenda in mind for them down the road. Maria and her friends were fascinated and intrigued to be contacted by another race of beings, but also soon picked up on their aggressive and viscous energy, despite the charming intellect that was projected. The Virile also encountered a second group of extraterrestrial beings though, and these were the Nordics, a benevolent Aryan human type of fifth-density consciousness who live on a planet circling our closest neighbor, Alpha Centauri. Over time, the members of the Virile group became more and more inclined towards the messages and purpose of this Nordic group, and they abandoned their relationship with the Draco, which definitely ruffled some scales. The Nordic group asked Maria to gather a select group of people together on a certain day for the purpose of receiving detailed plans for the construction of a spaceship, and so when the time came, the Virile gathered together in a small forester's cabin near Berchtesgaden, Germany, and it was on that cold winter day in 1919 that Sigrun, middle figure in the picture above, channeled detailed plans for what would be the first machine capable of advanced interdensity travel built by Homo sapiens. Over the next few years, Maria and her friends established a base of operations and, with assistance from the Nordic group, recruited a massive number of people from all across Germany and the surrounding countries to build several of these craft. These first machines weren't flying ships in the normal sense, rather they were disc-shaped craft that enabled one to move through time and space by traveling into the higher densities and then moving around by thought. And these were massive crafts, intended to transport large numbers of people off the planet. Word of this got out though. Through the network of secret societies, Hitler, Göring, and Himmler were all members of the Thule Society, and so it was that an emerging German political party with great interest in the occult got wind of the development of these craft, the Nazis. In their hunt for all things occult, the Nazis had already gotten hints of Agartha, ETs, and advanced technology by searching through Tibetan monasteries in the Himalayas, where they found records that had been recopied, preserved and passed down from the time of ancient Mu. They discovered plans for what looked like a spacecraft, and through questioning the monks they discovered that these holy men were actually in contact with various inner Earth groups. Various Nazis meeting with Tibetan monks. A few years later, just when their ships were nearing completion, the Vril Society were captured by the Nazis, who took over the entire facility and interrogated the members. This is particularly significant to us, because it was through this chain of events that the Nazis were first introduced to the Draco, and that relationship will be of prime importance in the rest of our story. Maria and the Vril had friends in very high places though, who brought pressure to bear on the Nazis, and the Vril were released without being harmed. Also, Hitler was happy enough to have a relationship now with the Draco, and he figured he could infiltrate or take over the Vril group at a later time if he so desired. Then the Vril group managed to leave the planet. They explored out into our galaxy and came back a few times, using underground bases in Antarctica for their home base, but eventually Maria and her friends evolved enough in consciousness through their interactions with the Nordic group that they ascended, meaning they gained the ability to live in the fourth density, and eventually the fifth. Maria put her learning to good use and went on to take the name Semjace. She returned to Earth in the 1970s to spread the teachings of unconditional love and harmony that radiate out from the fifth density, but nothing has been heard from her or the Vril since that time. 1942. The Nazis have perfected anti-gravitic flight. They took knowledge they had gotten from the Draco, which they had been working on since the 1920s, and later kidnapped a prominent scientist, Dr. Victor Schauberger, to implement some new ideas. Dr. Victor Schauberger. They had, like the Vril, already perfected interdensity travel, but they had yet to perfect anti-gravitic propulsion in the third density, which was necessary if one wanted to use this advanced tech in warfare, which they very much did. Dr. Schauberger had been studying anti-gravity vortexes in water. The inspiration for his research had actually come from observing fish swimming upstream, and he had realized that there were little energy vortexes in the water, places where it swirled in a certain way, and that the fish could intensify that energy by swirling its own body within it, thereby enabling it to jump upstream. Adolf Hitler had actually met Schauberger way back in 1934 to discuss principles of agriculture, forestry, and water engineering, and he was impressed by the ideas the doctor was already exploring around using implosion systems for propulsion, but he couldn't get his hands on him until Austria was annexed and the war was on, and by this point he knew that he needed Schauberger to expand upon the designs that Nazis had received from the Draco, so they could build anti-gravitic flying machines that could be weaponized and used in the war. So, in 1940, poor drive. Schauberger, a brilliant thinker and naturalist, was captured and institutionalized by the Nazis and made to develop the first Nazi third-density anti-gravitic flying machine, and by 1941, it was done. By 1942, aided by their new allies, the Draco, the Nazis were pumping out more than a dozen types of craft, all built by slave labor in huge underground caverns in Germany. The Germans also had production facilities established in Antarctica, where the Draco had opened access to more vast underground chambers. There are many caverns under Antarctica, many of which were, and still are, inhabited by the Draco. Some hold the ruins of the ancient, highly advanced civilization of Atlantis, and some hold ruins even more ancient, ruins left behind by the builder race, the Paatal, 200 million years ago. The Orion group still had their 3 massive motherships buried under the ice as well, and they cannibalized and made use of much of the Atlantean tech that was still functioning, though they had a harder time doing much with the tech left by the Paatal, much of which appeared to be functioning still, but which they could not comprehend. The Nazis set up shop there, alongside the Draco and the Orion group, where they continued to develop and refine their technology. This is just one article in a long publication that details historical events in our